You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 7,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The camera finds Father Ezekiel Barrett in a room where the shadows seem to breathe. He sits perfectly still in a worn leather chair, his hands resting on his knees. At 63, something about his face suggests he stopped aging years ago. Not from youth, but from becoming fixed, like an insect preserved in amber. When he blinks, it takes a fraction too long, as if he has to remember how. "They told me not to do this interview," he says. His voice is steady, almost pleasant. They were right, of course, but you need to understand what understanding costs. The interviewer, visible only as a shadow behind the camera, asks him when it began. Ezekiel smiles and the expression doesn't quite reach his eyes. "It began long before I was born, but for me, personally, it began on a Wednesday morning in September 2019. I remember because Wednesdays were my wife's yoga days. She'd be gone from 7 to 9, and I'd have the apartment to myself. I liked those quiet mornings. The silence felt clean." He pauses, his gaze drifting to somewhere beyond the camera. "The envelope was there when I woke at 6:15. Not on the floor where something slipped under the door would be. It was on my nightstand, inches from my face, as if someone had placed it there while I slept. The Vatican seal was pressed into red wax, and when I touched it, the wax was still warm." September 2019. Vatican City emerges from morning mist like a ship from fog. The cobblestones gleam black with dew. A cat crosses an empty courtyard and stops mid-stride, staring at something in an alley. It backs away slowly, then bolts. A street cleaner watches this happen and crosses himself. An automatic gesture he's performed 1,000 times, but this time feels necessary in a way he can't articulate. Father Ezekiel Barrett was 48 then, respected in his field, known for his methodical approach to authentication. Colleagues described him as meticulous to the point of obsession. He had debunked 17 supposed miracles, authenticated 12 genuine relics, and never once let superstition cloud his judgment. The Vatican valued this. They valued men who could look at mystery and see only puzzles to be solved. He'd grown up in Boston, the son of a literature professor and a librarian. His childhood was filled with books and questions, and his parents encouraged both. When he told them at 16 that he felt called to the priesthood, his mother had cried. Not from joy or disappointment, but from something else. Years later, she would tell him she'd had a dream the night before his announcement. In the dream, he was descending a staircase that went on forever, and she was calling him back, but he couldn't hear her. The envelope contained one line in Latin: "Veni ad locum ubi res nos memorant, custodiunt." Come to the place where we keep the things that remember us. He had never heard the Vatican Secret Archives described that way. In 12 years of service, he'd been in the archives perhaps 50 times, and each time the experience was the same. Dusty silence, the smell of old paper, the weight of accumulated knowledge. But this phrasing suggested something else. Not knowledge that humans remembered, but things that remembered humans. The descent took 20 minutes. 3 unmarked doors, each requiring a different key. The keys had been left for him at the main security desk in a small wooden box, with no note, no explanation. The guard who handed them to him was new, or at least Ezekiel had never seen him before. When Ezekiel asked who had left them, the guard looked confused and checked his log. "There's no record," the guard said. but they were here when I started my shift at 6. Someone must have dropped them off before I arrived. The first door was behind a tapestry that depicted St. Michael casting down the rebel angels. Ezekiel had passed this tapestry hundreds of times and never noticed the door. It was wooden, ancient, with iron hinges that looked medieval. The first key turned with a sound like breaking bone. Beyond was a stone corridor lit by a single bulb that seemed too dim to adequately illuminate the space, yet somehow he could see everything with perfect clarity. The walls were bare stone, but as he walked he noticed scratches in the rock. Not random marks, words, names. Hundreds of them carved at different heights, in different scripts, some so old the language was unrecognizable. He paused at one that looked recent. The stone around it was still pale, the carved letters sharp and clean. Forgive me, I should have stopped reading. Brother Augustine, 1987. The second door was at the end of the corridor. Iron, thick, with symbols carved into its surface that predated the Christian era. Sumerian, possibly, or older. They depicted figures climbing something that might have been a mountain, or might have been something else. The perspective was wrong, the geometry unsettling. The second key turned easily, too easily, as if the lock had been oiled recently despite the door's obvious age. Stone stairs spiraled down. Ezekiel counted them. At 50, he realized the stairs were getting narrower. At 100, the walls were close enough that his shoulders nearly brushed both sides. At 150, he had to turn sideways. The claustrophobia was intense, physical, like a hand pressing on his chest. At 200 steps, the stairs ended at the third door. This one was different. Not wood or iron, but something else. Stone, but smooth as glass, without any visible seams. It was covered in inscriptions that seemed to move in his peripheral vision. When he looked directly at them, they were static, but when he looked away, they writhed like living things. The third key shouldn't have worked. There was no visible lock. But when he held it near the door's surface, the stone simply opened, splitting down the middle like a mouth. Cardinal Matthias stood in the chamber beyond, beside a lead box on a stone table. The cardinal was 72, a tall man with silver hair that caught the torchlight. He held himself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining control, but his hands trembled slightly as he gestured to the box. The chamber itself was circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, carved from a single piece of stone. No seams, no joints, as if someone had hollowed out the inside of a boulder. The ceiling curved up into darkness beyond the reach of the torches that lined the walls. The torches burned without smoke, and their light had a quality that made Ezekiel think of deep water, of light filtered through fathoms of ocean. "Thank you for coming, Ezekiel," Cardinal Matthias said. His voice echoed strangely in the space, as if the chamber were much larger than it appeared. "I apologize for the dramatic summons. The nature of what we found seemed to require discretion." "What is this place?" Ezekiel asked. "I've never heard of it." "Few have. It's not on any map of the archives, not in any official documentation. Knowledge of it passes through oral tradition, cardinal to cardinal, for 2,000 years. Some call it the Archive of Last Resort. Others call it the Vault of Things That Remember. I prefer to think of it simply as the place we put things that are true but shouldn't be." Matthias moved to the lead box. It was perhaps 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 6 inches deep. Its surface was pitted with age and covered in symbols, warning signs Ezekiel recognized from a dozen different cultures and eras. He identified the evil eye from Mediterranean tradition, Bindrunic combinations from Norse magic, characters from Aramaic texts on exorcism, even a few Egyptian hieroglyphs associated with imprisonment and sealing. "We found this 3 days ago," Matthias continued, "during routine renovation work in the eastern wall of the Apostolic Palace. The workers broke through what they thought was solid stone and found a cavity This box was inside, suspended in the center of the space by nothing. Not hanging from chains or resting on a platform, simply floating in the middle of the empty cavity. That's impossible. Yes, the workers thought so too. The first man who touched it went home that evening and couldn't speak. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. His throat worked, his mouth moved, but no sound emerged. He's been silent for 3 days now. The doctors can find nothing physically wrong with him. Matthias placed his hand on the box's lid but didn't open it. The second worker who helped move it started counting. Just counting, backward from 9,000. He counts constantly, doesn't sleep, barely eats, just counts. His family called us yesterday. He's at 4,247 now. They want to know what happens when he reaches 0. I don't have an answer for them. What's inside the box? A manuscript, very old. The carbon dating suggests 1347, though that seems impossible given the preservation. The vellum is in perfect condition. The ink still smells fresh. When we first opened it, Father Tobias, you know him, the expert on medieval Latin, he looked at the first page for perhaps 30 seconds before he vomited and had to leave the room. He hasn't been back to work since. He sits in his apartment and draws circles, obsessively, thousands of them covering every surface, all the same size, all perfectly round despite being drawn freehand. Ezekiel felt something then. Not quite a sound, not quite a sensation, a pressure in the air, or perhaps in his thoughts, like standing too close to a large speaker playing a frequency just below the range of hearing. You can't hear it, but you feel it in your chest, in your bones. Why am I here? He asked. Because you don't believe in curses. You don't believe in hexes or demonic influence or any of the superstitious nonsense that accumulates around artifacts like this. You believe in facts, in evidence, in rational explanation. I need someone who won't be swayed by the fear that's already claimed 3 good men. I need you to authenticate this manuscript. Tell me what it is, and most importantly, tell me whether it's real or an elaborate forgery designed to disturb. Matthias finally opened the box. The hinges made no sound. Inside, nestled in cloth that might have been silk, or might have been something else, the weave was too fine, too perfect, lay the manuscript. It was bound in leather that looked black in the torchlight but seemed to shift to deep brown or dark green when viewed from different angles. The cover was smooth, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been polished by countless hands, yet it also felt cold, colder than the stone around them, colder than anything Ezekiel had touched before. Before you touch it, Matthias said, his voice grave, I need to tell you what we know. The manuscript is titled Novem Circuli Inferni, 9 Circles of Hell. It was written by a Franciscan monk named Brother Simeon. According to our records, Brother Simeon died in 1348 during the plague. His monastery in Romania burned to the ground that same year. Every monk inside was found dead in his cell. No signs of violence, no evidence of fire damage despite the ruins. Their faces were frozen in expressions of absolute terror. And the manuscript? Should not exist. If Brother Simeon died in 1348, he couldn't have written about events that, according to the text, occurred afterward. Yet the carbon dating is consistent. The ink, the vellum, the binding, all from the mid-14th century. More disturbing, we have records of someone matching Brother Simeon's description appearing in Vatican City in 1349, 1 year after his supposed death. Matthias pulled a folder from inside his robes and handed it to Ezekiel. Inside were photocopies of documents spanning centuries. A customs record from 1349 describing a Franciscan monk seeking audience with the Pope, identified as Brother Simeon of the Romanian monastery. A letter from 1527 mentioning a monk who appeared during the sack of Rome, warning the cardinals to seal certain chambers in the archives. A journal entry from 1870 describing a monk who walked into the Vatican during the Italian occupation, speaking to no one, touching nothing, simply standing in various locations as if measuring them. Each time witnesses described the same man, same age, perhaps 30, same distinctive scar over his left eye, same robes from the 14th century. The most recent sighting was 1943. A Swiss guard reported seeing him in the archives late one night. When challenged, the monk smiled and said, "Not yet. Almost, but not yet." Then he simply walked through a wall. The guard assumed he'd gone mad from stress and took a leave of absence. He never returned to service. Ezekiel set the folder down and reached for the manuscript. His fingers touched the cover. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, like touching a live wire, but the electricity was cold instead of hot. His hand jerked back involuntarily. "Yes," Matthias said quietly. "Everyone has that reaction the first time. You get used to it. Or perhaps it gets used to you." Ezekiel forced himself to touch it again. This time the sensation was bearable, a persistent wrongness that crept up his arm and settled somewhere behind his eyes. He opened the manuscript to the first page. The handwriting was immaculate, precise. Each letter formed with the care of a medieval scribe who knew that what he was creating would outlast him by centuries. The date at the top read Anno Domini, 1347, Mensis November, Dies Tertius, November 3rd, 1347, but it was what was written beneath the date that made Ezekiel's breath catch. "This account is prepared for those who will come after, for Father Josiah who will doubt, for Cardinal Matthias who will fear, for Father Ezekiel who will understand. May God forgive us for what we have seen and what we will see again." His own name, written in a manuscript that was nearly 700 years old. Ezekiel looked up at Cardinal Matthias. The Cardinal's expression was grim. "Yes, your name is there. Mine too. Father Josiah is in the archives above us right now, cataloguing texts. I called him down to see this yesterday. When he saw his name, he laughed. He laughed for 10 minutes straight, and then he started crying and couldn't stop. The doctors gave him something to help him sleep. He's resting now, but he insists on being here when you read the rest. He says someone needs to witness your face when you understand." "This is a forgery," Ezekiel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone added our names recently. It's elaborate, I'll grant you, but we tested the ink on the page where your name appears. It's consistent with the rest of the document. 700 years old. We've tested every page, every word. They're all the same age, all written at the same time. Your name has been in this manuscript since 1347, waiting for you to find it." Ezekiel felt dizzy. The pressure he'd felt earlier was stronger now, like hands pressing against his temples from inside his skull. "That's impossible." "Yes, add it to the list of impossible things about this manuscript." Matthias moved toward the chamber's exit. "Father Josiah is waiting upstairs. He's old, experienced, and has forgotten more about medieval texts than most scholars learn in a lifetime. He'll assist you with the translation and authentication. I'm assigning this as your top priority. Cancel everything else. I want to know what this is, where it really came from, and what we should do with it." "And if I refuse?" Cardinal Matthias paused at the door. "You won't, I can see it in your eyes. You're already hooked. The manuscript has you now. Everyone who sees their name in it becomes obsessed with understanding why. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. I'm sorry, Ezekiel. If I could have chosen anyone else, I would have. But the manuscript chose you. It chose all of us. We're just playing out a script that was written centuries before we were born." He left, and Ezekiel was alone with the manuscript in the circular chamber deep beneath the Vatican. He read the first entry. "I am Brother Simeon of the Franciscan Monastery of St. John in the Carpathian Mountains. I write this account in the year of our Lord 1347, in the hope that it will serve as warning to those who come after. I write it in Latin so that the learned may understand, but I fear that understanding is precisely what will doom them, as it has doomed me. On the 3rd day of November, between the hours of Vespers and Compline, that liminal time when day dies but night has not yet fully born itself, a merchant came to our monastery. His name was Petru. He would not enter our gates. He stood outside, one hand gripping the iron bars, the other making the sign against evil that the local peasants use, the one that predates Christianity and invokes older protections. He smelled of pine smoke and fear. He told us of a door. In the mountains, 3 days' journey north of our monastery, the hunters and shepherds knew every stone, every tree, every cave and crevice. They passed these places daily. They knew them as a man knows his own face in a mirror. But 4 days ago, a shepherd following a lost goat came upon a door that should not have existed. It was set into the face of a cliff above a frozen stream, in a place where there had been only smooth rock the day before. The door was stone, massive, carved with inscriptions that hurt to look upon. The shepherd did not approach it. He said the door was looking at him, though it had no eyes. He said it was waiting, though it made no sound. Word spread among the mountain folk. Others went to see. All reported the same. A door where no door had been. A door that seemed both ancient, weathered by centuries, and fresh, carved yesterday. A door that watched those who came to look at it. Petru had been hired by a local nobleman to investigate. He approached the door with 3 armed men. When he stood before it, he said, it opened. Not by his hand, not by any mechanism he could see. It simply opened, swinging inward on hinges that made no sound, revealing darkness beyond. The darkness was wrong, he said. Not the normal darkness of a cave or unlit room. This darkness had presence, texture. It moved like water but made no sound. Looking into it produced a sensation of falling, even while standing still. One of the armed men entered despite Petru's protests. He took 3 steps into the darkness and stopped, stood there motionless for several minutes. Then he turned around and walked out. His face was calm, peaceful even. He looked at his companions and said, "It's beautiful in there. You should see. We should all go in together." His voice was wrong. Petru couldn't explain how, but the voice was wrong. It was the man's voice, but speaking with different intentions. The words were his, but the thought behind them came from elsewhere. The man turned and walked back into the darkness. This time he did not stop. He continued until the darkness swallowed him completely. They waited for 3 hours. He did not return. They called his name, no answer. They threw torches into the darkness. The torches disappeared, their light extinguished instantly, as if the darkness was eating the fire. Petru told us all this while standing outside our gates, refusing to enter, refusing even to stop making that old sign against evil. He said the nobleman who hired him was organizing an expedition to enter the door, to find his lost guard, to explore what lay beyond. But Petru wouldn't go back. He said he'd had dreams since seeing the door. Dreams of descending, of chambers filled with impossible things, of a voice calling his name from directions that didn't exist. My brothers Matthias, Josiah and Ezekiel, we debated long into the night whether to investigate. Brother Matthias argued we should inform Rome, should wait for instructions, should approach such a thing carefully and with proper authority. Brother Josiah said we should pray first, should fast and prepare our souls for whatever we might encounter. But Brother Ezekiel said what I was thinking. We've come all this way. We need to know. And so we decided to go. Ezekiel stopped reading. His hands were shaking, not from fear, not yet, but from the eerie precision of the account. Brother Simeon had captured not just the words, but the thought patterns, the exact reasoning Ezekiel himself would use, the way he approached mysteries. He looked around the circular chamber. The torches still burned without smoke, the walls still pressed in with that subtle claustrophobia, but now he noticed something he'd missed before. There were scratches in the stone floor. Faint, old but deliberate. They formed 9 circles, concentric, descending in size from the outer wall toward the centre where the table with the lead box stood. And within each circle were names. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, carved so small he had to kneel down to read them. He recognised some. Cardinals from the 15th century, monks from the Dark Ages, popes whose reigns had been brief and troubled, and scattered among the ancient names, newer ones. Brother Augustine, 1987, Sister Maria Teresa, 1956, Father Giovanni, 2003, and at the very centre, in the smallest circle, 3 names freshly carved, the stone around them still pale. Father Josiah, Cardinal Matthias, Father Ezekiel. Someone had already added their names to whatever this was. Someone knew they would be here, reading this manuscript, standing in this chamber. Or perhaps, and this thought made his stomach turn, they had carved their own names. Perhaps everyone who came here eventually carved their own name, understanding somehow that they were part of something that had been happening for much longer than they'd been alive. He forced himself to stand, forced himself to keep reading. Father Josiah arrived an hour later. The old priest looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He carried a laptop, an anachronism in this ancient space, and several notebooks. He set them on the table beside the manuscript without looking directly at it. "You've seen your name," Josiah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And you understand what it means?" "No, I don't think I do." Josiah finally looked at the manuscript, and his expression was one of profound sadness, mixed with something else. Resignation, perhaps, or recognition. "It means we're part of it now. Whatever this is, whatever process began 700 years ago, or 7,000 or 7 million, we're rungs in its ladder. The manuscript doesn't predict the future, it creates it. Or perhaps it's always existed in all times simultaneously, and reading it simply makes us aware of our place in its structure." "That's insane." "Yes, is that supposed to make it untrue?" Josiah pulled out a chair and sat heavily. "I've been studying this manuscript for 2 days. I've cross-referenced every name mentioned in it against Vatican records. Every single person named in this document either existed historically or exists now. Their descriptions match, their roles match, their fates." He trailed off, staring at nothing. Their fates? The manuscript tells us what happens to people, not as prediction but as history. And it's never wrong. Brother Augustine, whose name you probably saw, carved in the corridor. The manuscript mentions him, says he disappeared in 1987 after reading about the 6th circle. He did, vanished from a locked room in the Vatican. We found his apartments empty except for thousands of mirrors, every surface covered with them, all facing inward toward the centre of the room. Josiah opened one of his notebooks. The pages were covered in cramped handwriting, citations, dates, cross-references. Sister Maria Teresa, 1956. The manuscript says she entered the circles and emerged changed. Record shows she returned from a trip to Romania and immediately requested to be placed in solitary contemplation. She spent 30 years in a cell, never speaking, never seeing anyone, before she died. The nuns who prepared her body for burial said she was smiling. They said her hands were positioned as if she were climbing. This proves nothing. Someone could have added these details after the fact. The ink is 700 years old, Ezekiel. All of it. We've tested every page, every word. More than that, we've found earlier references to this manuscript. Letters between cardinals in the 10th century mentioning the document that names those who will read it, a fragment of a text from the 2nd century referring to the account that writes itself forward through time. This manuscript has existed longer than Christianity, and it's been doing the same thing throughout history, finding people, naming them, pulling them into whatever it describes. Ezekiel sat down across from Josiah. The pressure behind his eyes was constant now, a dull ache that made it hard to focus on anything except the manuscript. What does it describe? What are these circles? I don't know. I've only read through the 4th circle and I had to stop. The descriptions. Josiah swallowed hard. They're detailed, viscerally detailed, and while I read them, I could smell things. Impossible things. Wind that smells like screaming, blood that smells like flowers, and I started having dreams. The same dream every time I close my eyes. I'm in an underground cathedral praying in a language I don't know, and something vast is moving through me, using me as a bridge to get somewhere else. Hallucinations, stress-induced. I'm not alone. Josiah leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I called every person I could find who had ever worked with this manuscript. Most are dead. The few who are alive refuse to speak about it. Except one. Father Chen in Taiwan. He worked with it in the 1970s. When I finally got him on the phone, he asked me one question. Have you seen your name yet? When I said yes, he hung up. But before he did, I heard him say something in the background. He was talking to someone else in the room. He said, another one has been called. The ladder grows longer. They worked through the night, Ezekiel reading aloud while Josiah took notes, cross-referenced, verified. The manuscript described Brother Simeon's journey to the door, in the mountains. The account was detailed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were recording, who understood that every detail mattered. The 4 monks travelled for 3 days through increasingly desolate terrain. The local villages grew smaller, more isolated. The people they encountered warned them away. An old woman in the last village before the mountains proper told them, that place makes holes in the world, holes that look like doors. Things climb through those holes, things that were underneath, trying to get on top. When they asked what she meant, she made the sign against evil and wouldn't speak again. They found the door on the evening of the 3rd day, exactly as Petru had described. A cliff face that rose sheer and smooth, and set into it a door. Massive, stone, covered in inscriptions that seemed to writhe when viewed peripherally. Brother Simeon described those inscriptions in detail. Ezekiel stopped reading and grabbed Josiah's laptop, pulling up reference files on ancient languages. He spent 20 minutes comparing Brother Simeon's descriptions to known texts. These symbols, Ezekiel said slowly, they're from different languages, different eras. This one is Sumerian. This cluster is Proto-Indo-European. This section resembles Linear A, but with modifications. And this. He zoomed in on his reference image. This shouldn't exist. This is a symbol from a language that wasn't discovered until 1950, found on fragments of pottery in Turkey. Brother Simeon couldn't have known about it in 1347. Unless the door showed him, Josiah said quietly. Unless the door has always had these symbols, from every time, every language that would ever exist. Past and future both, carved into stone that exists in between. In the manuscript, Brother Simeon describes standing before the door for an hour, debating. Brother Matthias wanted to return. Brother Josiah wanted to pray. But Brother Ezekiel approached the door, and when he did, it opened. The description of what lay beyond was brief. The darkness welcomed us. It had been waiting. Ezekiel read through the rest of that first night, and as dawn, light began filtering down through ventilation shafts high above the circular chamber, he finished the account of the first circle. The vestibule, Brother Simeon called it. A vast chamber carved from living rock, but the carving was wrong. Organic. Flowing. as if the stone had been grown rather than cut, or as if something had moved through solid rock the way a worm moves through earth, leaving these passages behind. The chamber was filled with people. They stood scattered throughout the space, caught in various poses of movement. A man mid-stride, 1 foot raised, forever about to take a step he would never complete. A woman reaching for something, her fingers stretched out, frozen an inch from whatever she'd been trying to grasp. A child looking over his shoulder, mouth open as if calling to someone, the call eternally unfinished. Their eyes were open, their chests rose and fell with breath, but they could not move, could not speak, could only watch as the 4 monks walked among them. Brother Simeon recognized some of them. He'd seen their faces on missing person reports, heard stories of travellers who'd vanished in these mountains. A priest from Vienna disappeared 3 years prior. A merchant from Constantinople. A woman in noble dress from what looked like the previous century, her clothes outdated but perfectly preserved. As the monks passed, all the frozen people's eyes tracked them, following their movement with terrible awareness. The eyes held no terror, no plea for help. Instead, they held something worse. Acceptance. Understanding. As if they knew something the monks didn't and were patiently waiting for the monks to learn it too. Brother Simeon approached the priest from Vienna. The man's eyes moved to meet his. Brother Simeon asked if he could hear him. The eyes blinked once, slowly, deliberately. "How long have you been here?" The eyes blinked 3 times, 3 years, frozen in this moment of eternal beginning for 3 years, aware of every second. Brother Simeon asked if there was pain. The eyes blinked once, yes. He asked if the man wanted to be freed. The eyes didn't blink. They simply stared, and in that stare was something that made Brother Simeon step back. The man didn't want to be freed. He was waiting for something. They were all waiting. At the far end of the vestibule, there was another doorway. It led deeper. And though every instinct screamed at them to turn back, to flee, to escape while they still could, the 4 monks felt a pull. Not physical, deeper than that, a gentle insistence in their thoughts, soft as a lover's whisper, "Come deeper, come see. You've come all this way, don't stop now." Brother Ezekiel in the manuscript said what Father Ezekiel in the chamber was thinking. We need to understand what this is. And so they descended to the second circle. Ezekiel stopped reading as dawn fully broke. His eyes ached, his head throbbed. But worse than the physical discomfort was the sensation that he had been reading for much longer than one night. That he'd been reading this manuscript for years, for decades, and only now was remembering doing so. Father Josiah had fallen asleep in his chair, his head tilted back, mouth slightly open. But even in sleep, he was counting. His lips moved silently, forming numbers. Ezekiel watched for a moment and realized Josiah was counting backward, from some high number descending. Just like the worker who touched the lead box, just like everyone who encountered this manuscript seemed to develop strange compulsions. Ezekiel stood and walked to the circular chamber's wall, examining the names carved into the floor more carefully now that dawn light filtered down. The circles of names formed a spiral, he realized. Not concentric rings, but a single continuous line, spiraling inward from the outer wall to the center. One name connected to the next, all the way in. And if he traced the spiral forward, following the progression of names through time, they led directly to the 3 names in the center. Josiah, Matthias, Ezekiel. The end of the spiral, or perhaps the beginning of the next revolution. He left the chamber, climbing the narrow stairs, passing through the 3 doors, emerging finally into the upper archives. The normal archives where tourists sometimes visited, where scholars conducted research under controlled conditions. The transition from that deep place to this ordinary space felt like surfacing from deep water, a pressure change, a popping in his ears, a sudden awareness of having been somewhere that operated under different physical laws. It was 7:30 a.m. His phone had 17 missed calls from his wife. He called her back. "Where have you been?" Her voice was strained. "I called all night. I came home from yoga and you were gone. No note, nothing. I've been terrified." "I'm sorry. I had an emergency at work. A new discovery that needed immediate attention." "You couldn't send a text, one message to let me know you were safe?" He looked down at his phone. The battery was at 87%. The signal was full. But when he checked his messages, the phone showed he had sent her a text at 8 p.m. last night. "Working late. Don't wait up. Love you." He had no memory of sending it. He stared at the message. His writing style, his habits, the way he always ended with "love you," even in brief messages. But he hadn't sent it. He'd been reading the manuscript all night, unless... "Are you okay?" his wife asked. "You sound strange." "I'm fine, just tired. I'll be home soon." He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he scrolled through his messages. There were others. Responses to colleagues, asking about projects, updates to his calendar, an email to the Vatican Administration Office requesting 2 weeks of uninterrupted time for urgent research. He'd sent all of them at various points throughout the night, while reading the manuscript, while his conscious attention was entirely focused on Brother Simeon's account. Some part of him had been maintaining his normal life, sending messages, managing obligations, all without his awareness. Or something was doing it for him. Back in the circular chamber, Father Josiah was awake, looking worse than before. His hands shook as he poured coffee from a thermos he'd brought. "Did you sleep?" Ezekiel asked. "I don't think I know how to anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I'm there, in the congregation. I can feel it now, even awake, like I'm in 2 places at once. Here and there, sitting in a pew, praying in that wrong Latin, helping to call it through." "Calling what through?" "I don't know yet, but I know it's patient. It's been climbing for a very long time, and it doesn't mind waiting a little longer. Each person who reads the manuscript is another rung, another step up. We're not reading about the ladder, Ezekiel. We're building it by understanding it." Ezekiel sat back down at the table. The manuscript lay open where he'd left it. The page showed the beginning of the second circle's description. He hadn't touched it, hadn't turned to that page. He'd stopped reading on the previous page. Yet here it was, open to exactly where he needed to continue. "Did you open this?" he asked Josiah. The old priest shook his head. "It opens itself now. To the right page, always to the right page. It knows where you are. In the reading, it knows where you need to be." Ezekiel reached for it, then stopped. What happens if we stop reading? What if we just refuse to continue? Others have tried. Brother Augustine lasted 6 days before he came back to it. Sister Maria Teresa made it 2 weeks. Father Giovanni claimed he'd never touch it again, that he'd rather die than read another word. They found him in his office 3 days later, the manuscript open before him, dead of a heart attack. His eyes were open, focused on a page near the end. The last page he would have read described the 8th circle. When they checked his medical records, they found he'd had a heart condition no one knew about. The manuscript knew. It let him read until his heart couldn't take anymore, then showed him what happens in the 8th circle, and the shock killed him. That's murder, is it, if a text describes reality so accurately that reading about something causes it to happen? Is the text killing you, or are you killing yourself by choosing to understand? Josiah's hands wrapped around his coffee cup, seeking warmth. I've thought about this constantly for 2 days. The manuscript doesn't make things happen. It describes what will happen, and by reading that description we make it true. It's not prophecy, it's instruction. A script we follow because we can't imagine doing anything else. Cardinal Matthias entered the chamber at 8:15. looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His silver hair seemed more white than silver now, and his hands clutched a folder so tightly the leather was creased. "I've been researching," he said without preamble. "I've gone through every reference to Brother Simeon I could find in our archives. Do you know what I discovered? He's mentioned in 47 different documents spanning from 1349 to 1943. Always the same. Always appearing in Rome, always during times of crisis, always seeking access to the deepest archives. And in every report, the person who encounters him notes the same thing. He smells like earth and growing things." Matthias dropped the folder on the table. In 1527, during the sack of Rome, he appeared and told Cardinal Pucci that certain chambers needed to be sealed immediately. Pucci asked why. Brother Simeon said, "Because the ladder is growing faster now. The world is remembering how to climb." They sealed 4 chambers that day. Do you know what they found in those chambers? People. Living people who had been missing for decades, standing perfectly still, frozen mid-movement. The vestibule. He was warning them about the vestibule appearing under Rome. "That's impossible," Ezekiel said. "The manuscript describes the circles in Romania. The circles aren't in Romania. They're wherever they need to be. The door appears, the circles manifest, people become rungs. Geography is irrelevant. There are reports from 17 different countries over the centuries. Chambers found underground that match Brother Simeon's descriptions. Sometimes they're empty, sometimes they're occupied. But they're always the same 9 circles, always in the same order, always serving the same purpose." Matthias sat heavily in a chair. "I spoke to Cardinal Chen in Taiwan this morning. He worked with this manuscript in 1974. Do you know what he told me? He said, I read to the 6th circle and had to stop. Not because I was afraid, but because I realized I wanted to keep reading. I wanted to understand. I wanted to see all 9. I wanted to know what was at the bottom. And that wanting was stronger than anything I'd ever felt. Stronger than my faith. Stronger than my love for God. It was the purest desire I've ever experienced, and that purity terrified me, because I understood that the desire wasn't mine. It was the manuscript's. It was what's climbing through us, using our desire for understanding as a ladder." "So what did he do?" Ezekiel asked. "He had himself locked in a monastery in the mountains, stayed there for 5 years. No access to the manuscript, no contact with anyone who'd read it. He thought he'd escaped. Then, one day, a young monk at the monastery asked him for help translating a text. The monk had found it in a storage room tucked behind some old scrolls. It was 3 pages from the manuscript, just 3 pages, describing part of the 6th circle. Somehow the manuscript had found him, or perhaps those pages had always been there, waiting for the right moment. Did he read them? No, he burned them without looking. But he said that as they burned, he could smell flowers growing through flesh, could hear prayers in reversed Latin, could feel himself sitting in a pew in an underground cathedral. The manuscript didn't need him to read the words. It had already marked him. He was already part of it. Reading it again would have just made him more aware of what he'd already become. They sat in silence for a long moment. The torches flickered, though there was no wind in the sealed chamber. The pressure Ezekiel had been feeling since first touching the manuscript intensified. It wasn't pain exactly, more like anticipation. Like standing at the edge of a high dive, looking down at the water, knowing you're going to jump, knowing you've already decided, just waiting for your body to catch up with your mind's commitment. "I'm going to keep reading," Ezekiel said. "I know," Matthias replied. "We all knew you would. That's why your name is in the manuscript. That's why you're here. Not because we chose you, but because it chose you, and we're just following the script it wrote 700 years ago, or 7,000, or since the beginning of time. I don't think the manuscript was created. I think it's always existed, pulling its own origin backward through time, ensuring it would exist whenever it needed to be found. Josiah opened his laptop. I've prepared translations of the Latin, cross-references to historical accounts, maps of where similar phenomena have been reported. It won't help you understand what the circles are. I don't think anyone can truly understand that. But it will help you document what you're reading, provide context, give the illusion that this is a research project and not something else entirely. What else would it be? Ezekiel asked. A summoning, Josiah said quietly. Every time someone reads this manuscript, every time someone understands what it describes, they become part of the mechanism. They become a rung in the ladder, and what's climbing gets a little closer to the top, to here, to now, to the world we know. Ezekiel turned to the page describing the second circle. The Storm, Brother Simeon had titled it, but as Ezekiel read the description, he understood that name was inadequate, insufficient to capture what the monk had witnessed. The second chamber was larger than the first, its ceiling lost in darkness high above, but the space was filled with wind. Not normal wind. This wind had been screaming for so long, it had developed texture, personality, almost intelligence. It moved through the chamber in patterns that seemed purposeful, creating vortices and corridors and walls of air that pushed and pulled with terrible force. Bodies hung suspended in the wind. Monks, travellers, local villagers, their clothes shredded to ribbons that still whipped around them, their skin moving in waves as the wind rippled across flesh, their hair streaming out behind them in frozen arcs. They had been dead for years, decades perhaps, desiccated and hollow, but the wind kept them aloft, kept them dancing, kept them moving in patterns that looked almost like ritual. One of them, an old monk whose empty eye sockets stared at nothing, opened his mouth and wind poured out. Not breath, wind, as if his body were hollow, just a skin bag the wind wore, and through his mouth came the accumulated screaming of everyone who had ever been trapped in this chamber. The sound was layered, harmonic, dozens of voices all screaming the same note, all blending together into something that was no longer human, but hadn't quite become something else. Brother Matthias in the manuscript tried to turn back at this point. He grabbed Brother Simeon's arm and shouted over the wind, "This is hell! We're in hell! We need to leave!" But Brother Simeon turned to respond and realized the doorway through which they'd entered was gone. The wall was smooth stone, seamless, as if there had never been an opening. They were sealed in. The only direction available was deeper. "We go forward," Brother Ezekiel said in the manuscript, "or we stay here and join the dance." As Ezekiel read this, he felt a breeze on his face. Impossible. The circular chamber was sealed, deep underground. No ventilation except the high shafts that let in light. But the breeze was there, gentle at first, then growing stronger. It smelled of old dust and dried flesh and something else, something like the scent of a scream if screams had odour. He looked up from the manuscript. Father Josiah's hair was moving slightly, as if in a breeze. Cardinal Matthias's robes rippled. "Do you feel that?" Ezekiel asked. Both men nodded. "It's been getting stronger," Josiah said, "since you started reading about the second circle. The manuscript doesn't just describe things, it invokes them, makes them partially present. We're experiencing echoes of what Brother Simeon experienced. The circles are bleeding through." Ezekiel forced himself to continue reading. Brother Simeon's group pressed forward through the storm, fighting against wind that seemed determined to hold them back or push them into the dancing dead. At one point, Brother Josiah in the manuscript got too close to one of the suspended bodies. The corpse's hand shot out, moved by wind or by something else impossible to say, and grabbed his wrist. The dead monk's mouth opened and wind poured out, wind that carried words. "Join us, we've been alone so long, join the dance, the wind knows the way, the wind will carry you home." They pulled Brother Josiah free and stumbled forward and finally reached another doorway. This one led down a steep decline, stairs carved into living rock, descending into darkness that seemed thicker, more present than normal shadow. Brother Ezekiel descended first, always first, the third circle, the feast. This chamber was a long hall, perhaps 100 feet, with a high ceiling supported by columns, carved to look like rib bones. The effect was disturbing, as if they had entered the chest cavity of some vast creature, and these fossilized ribs were all that remained. Down the center of the hall ran a table, stone or perhaps wood, so old it had petrified. Set along this table were chairs, high-backed, ornate, and in these chairs sat monks, perhaps 30 of them, all dressed in robes from different orders, different eras. Some of the robes were ancient, rotted to threads. Others looked relatively fresh. The monks sat with rigid posture, their hands moving in mechanical precision, lifting cutlery to their mouths. Forks and knives that had tarnished black with age, spoons that had warped and corroded. Their plates were empty, had always been empty, would always be empty. But they ate anyway. They lifted empty forks to mouths that bled from 1,000 cuts, the metal edges slicing their lips, their tongues, the insides of their cheeks with each mechanical movement. They bit down on nothing, swallowed nothing, and still the motion continued. Lift, bite, swallow, lift, bite, swallow. Their throats had been opened, gaping wounds from ear to ear, wounds that had long since stopped bleeding, but never closed. And through these wounds you could see their esophagi working, swallowing nothing into nothing, feeding a hunger that would never be satisfied. What disturbed Brother Simeon most, what made even Ezekiel, reading the account, feel nauseated, was their expressions. They smiled as they ate. Their eyes were joyful, almost ecstatic. Their faces held the expression of people experiencing the greatest meal of their lives, tasting flavors beyond description, savoring textures and sensations that physical food could never provide. Whatever they thought they were consuming, it sustained them in ways that actual nourishment never could. As the 4 monks walked past the table, one of the eaters looked up. His face was split by a smile so wide it had torn the corners of his mouth. Blood ran down his chin, dripped onto his plate, but his expression remained joyful. "Brothers," he called, his voice wet and thick, speaking through the wound in his throat. "Won't you join us? The meal never ends. The feast is eternal. We dine on understanding, on knowledge, on the pure essence of truth. Physical food was nothing compared to this. Join us. Your place is at the table awaiting." Brother Simeon recognized him. Father Giovanni from the Vatican, disappeared 5 years prior while researching Gnostic texts in the Middle East. He'd been a friend, a colleague, a man known for his intellectual rigor and spiritual depth. Now he sat at this table, bleeding and smiling, eating nothing with the fervor of a starving man at a banquet. "What are you eating?" Brother Simeon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Understanding," Giovanni replied joyfully. "Pure, unfiltered understanding. Every mystery revealed, every question answered. It pours into us endlessly, and we consume it, and it fills us with such perfect knowledge that nothing else matters. The pain is nothing. The bleeding is nothing. We're feeding on the truth of everything, and it's more satisfying than anything that exists in the world above." "What truth?" Giovanni's smile widened impossibly. "The truth about what you are, what we all are, what we've always been. Rungs, Brother Simeon. We're rungs in a ladder that has no bottom and no top, just an eternal middle where we climb forever, and the climbing is the point, and reaching anywhere would ruin it. We eat this truth, and it sustains us better than any illusion of separateness ever could." As Ezekiel read this, his stomach cramped. Not with hunger, but with its opposite. A feeling of being too full, of having consumed too much, of his body trying to process something it wasn't designed to handle. He looked down at the table in the circular chamber. It was stone, bare, empty. But for just a moment, he saw a plate there, saw cutlery, saw his own hand reaching for a fork. He blinked, and the vision vanished. "It's getting stronger," Cardinal Matthias said. His voice was strained. "The more you read, the more present they become. The circles are trying to manifest here. This chamber has always been a thin place, a weak spot in the wall, between what is and what could be. That's why the manuscript is kept here. That's why everyone who reads it is brought here. We're feeding the circles, making them more real. And when they're real enough..." "What?" Ezekiel demanded. "What happens when they're real enough?" "They stop being somewhere else and start being here. The ninth circle opens into the world. And what's been climbing through it all this time finally reaches the top." Ezekiel wanted to stop reading. Wanted to close the manuscript, leave the chamber, forget everything he'd learned. But his eyes were already moving to the next paragraph. His hands were already turning the page. The choice had been made before he was aware of making it. Or perhaps the choice had been made 700 years ago when Brother Simeon first wrote his name in this manuscript. The fourth circle, the weight. Brother Simeon's description became harder to read here. Not because the Latin was difficult. It remained precise, clear, but because the content began to affect perception. The words seemed to press down on the page, and reading them felt like lifting something heavy, like each sentence had mass and weight, and required effort to process. The entrance to the fourth circle was low. The 4 monks had to crawl, and as they crawled they felt gravity intensify. Not suddenly, but gradually, a steady increase in weight that made each movement forward require more effort than the last. The tunnel went on for perhaps 100 feet, but it felt like miles. By the end, they were dragging themselves forward on their bellies, arms trembling with exhaustion, backs aching from the pressure, lungs struggling to draw breath against the weight. The chamber beyond was vast and low, the ceiling pressed down perhaps 4 feet above the floor, and scattered throughout this space, flattened against the stone, like flowers pressed in books, were bodies. They had been compressed flat. Not crushed violently, but pressed slowly, steadily, gravity intensifying over months or years, until they were reduced to the thickness of parchment. Their features were still visible, faces pressed against stone, mouths open in silent screams, eyes bulging sideways. Their bodies spread out around them like shadows, like the stains left by bodies that had melted into the floor. But they were alive. Their hearts beat, slow as glaciers, once per minute, once per hour. Their lungs drew breath, taking minutes to complete a single inhalation. Their eyes moved, tracking the monk's crawling progress with terrible awareness. One of them, a priest whose vestments had been pressed into his flattened flesh, creating a collage of cloth and skin, managed to speak. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the stone itself. "Welcome, brothers. The wait is patient. It takes its time. First, it steals your movement, then your breath, then your thoughts, until all that's left is awareness. Pure, unending awareness. And in that awareness, you understand what it means to be pressed down into the foundation of everything." Brother Josiah in the manuscript began to weep. Tears ran down his face as he crawled, dripping onto the flattened form of a monk they had known from Rome. The compressed priest's eyes followed the tears as they fell, and his mouth opened slightly, a movement that took perhaps 30 seconds to complete, in what might have been a smile, or might have been a scream. "How long?" Brother Josiah asked. "How long have you been here?" The answer took 5 minutes to arrive, the voice vibrating up through stone. Time stops, having meaning, when every second feels like a year. I've been here 3 days or 3 centuries, both are true. They crawled forward, fighting against gravity that grew stronger with each inch. Brother Matthias in the manuscript couldn't continue. He lay flat, gasping, unable to move forward or back. The others tried to pull him, but the weight was too great. They were forced to leave him there, crawling on without him, promising to return, knowing they wouldn't. Brother Simeon wrote, "I looked back once and saw Brother Matthias being pressed slowly into the floor. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he simply looked at us with an expression of profound understanding, as if the weight had revealed something to him, some truth about existence that made resistance pointless. His body flattened, and his heart continued beating, and his eyes continued to see, and he became part of the foundation." Ezekiel stopped reading. His own chest felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on it. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The chair felt too solid beneath him, as if he was sinking into it, being absorbed by it. "Don't stand up," Josiah warned. "I made that mistake earlier. Fell down. Took me 10 minutes to get back up. The weight from the 4th circle. It's here now. Not as strong as in the manuscript, but present. Getting stronger the more you read." Cardinal Matthias was bent over the table, breathing hard. "I feel it, like the world is pressing down, like gravity is doubled. I've felt this before." "When?" Ezekiel managed to ask. "The last time someone read past the 4th circle, Father Giovanni, 2003. He read it here, in this chamber. For 3 days afterward, everyone who entered this room reported feeling heavy. Some couldn't leave. They had to be carried out. We sealed the chamber for a year until the effect faded, but it never completely went away. You can still feel it sometimes, like the memory of weight, like the echo of being pressed down." "We should stop," Ezekiel said, but even as he spoke, his eyes were moving back to the manuscript, finding his place, continuing. Brother Simeon and Brother Ezekiel, now only 2, having lost Matthias to the weight, pressed forward and found stairs leading down. These stairs were steeper, almost a shaft, descending at an angle that made climbing down treacherous. They descended for what felt like hours. At the bottom, they heard water. The 5th circle, the baptism. The chamber was flooded. Water filled it from floor to ceiling, but water of a colour that shouldn't exist in nature. Black, but not the black of ink or darkness. Black like old blood mixed with ink. Black like the space between stars. Black like the water at the bottom of the deepest ocean trench where no light has ever penetrated, but the water was clear, perfectly clear. You could see through it as easily as air. The contradiction was unsettling. Black but transparent, obscuring nothing, while being utterly devoid of light. And standing in this water, submerged from floor to ceiling, were monks. They stood in various depths. Some were submerged only to their waists, hands reaching up toward the ceiling far above. Others were neck deep, their faces just below the surface, features distorted by the water. Still others stood on the chamber floor, fully submerged, 20 feet down, hands extended upward in perpetual reaching. Their lungs were full of that black water, had been full for years, for decades, drowning without end, without relief, without the mercy of death. Their faces were serene beneath the surface. Not peaceful, serene. There's a difference. Peace suggests rest, completion. Serenity is ongoing, active, a choice to accept what cannot be changed. These monks had passed through panic and terror and emerged into a place where drowning was simply what they were now, where the water in their lungs was as natural as air had once been, where breathing and drowning had merged into a single state of being. Brother Simeon and Brother Ezekiel waded into the water, It was cold, and as it rose around them, to their knees, their waists, their chests, they felt it pulling at them, not with current but with intent, as if the water itself was aware and was inviting them deeper, inviting them to submerge, to fill their lungs, to join the others in their eternal drowning. One of the submerged monks, a woman in robes that suggested she came from centuries earlier, opened her mouth. Black water poured out, poured in, poured out again in rhythm with her still beating heart, and through that water she spoke, her voice liquid and thick. Don't fight it, brothers. The water is patient. The water is kind. It fills you so slowly you don't notice until you're full. And when you're full, when there's nothing left of you but water and the memory of having been something else, you understand. We're not drowning, we're being baptized, over and over, eternally initiated into the truth of what we are. What are we? Brother Simeon asked. The woman smiled beneath the water. Vessels. Hollow things waiting to be filled. We spend our lives pretending to be solid, but we're not. We're empty spaces shaped like people, and the water knows this, and the water fills us. And that filling is the most honest thing we've ever experienced. Brother Ezekiel in the manuscript turned to Brother Simeon and spoke, but his voice was strange, as if he'd already begun to drown. She's right, can you feel it? How hollow we are, how much empty space there is inside us, just waiting for something to fill it. We've been carrying that emptiness our whole lives, filling it with faith and purpose and meaning, but it's all been temporary. The water is permanent. The water is honest. And Brother Simeon realized his companion had breathed in the water, not choking on it, not drowning, but breathing it as if it were air. Brother Ezekiel's lungs filled and emptied with black water, and his eyes were serene, and he was sinking deeper, and he was smiling. Brother Simeon grabbed him, tried to pull him back toward the entrance, but Brother Ezekiel was heavier now, filled with water, and he sank like a stone. The last thing Brother Simeon saw before the water closed over his companion's head was that serene smile and eyes that suggested Brother Ezekiel had finally found something he'd been searching for his whole life. Alone now, Brother Simeon swam forward. The water grew deeper. He dove down, lungs burning, and found another passage at the bottom of the flooded chamber. He swam through it, his vision tunneling, his chest aching for air, certain he would drown before finding the next chamber. He broke the surface gasping, pulled himself onto stone, and lay there coughing water that was blacker than the water in the chamber, as if it had become even darker inside his lungs. Ezekiel, reading this, felt water in his throat. Impossible. He was sitting in a dry chamber deep under the Vatican, nowhere near water. But he felt it nonetheless, cold and invasive, filling spaces that should be empty, occupying him in ways that felt both wrong and inevitable. He coughed, and water splashed onto the manuscript page. Black water. It spread across the vellum, and where it touched the ink, the letters seemed to swim, rearranging themselves into new words, new meanings. Father Josiah leaned over and looked at the water on the page. It's happening faster now. The circles are manifesting more strongly. Usually it takes weeks of reading before physical phenomena appear. You're racing through it, as if you're trying to reach the end before you understand what reaching the end means. What does it mean? I don't know, no one's ever read all 9 circles and returned to tell us. Everyone who finishes either disappears or changes so fundamentally they might as well have disappeared. Father Giovanni read to the 8th circle before his heart gave out. He got close but not close enough. You're going to make it, aren't you? You're going to read all 9. Ezekiel wanted to say no, wanted to close the manuscript and walk away, but he looked down at the page, at the black water spreading across it, and he knew Josiah was right. He was going to finish. The decision had been made. Perhaps it had always been made, written into the manuscript 700 years ago, or 7,000, or since before time had meaning. He turned the page, the 6th circle, the confession. Brother Simeon's handwriting became more erratic here. The letters were still legible but showed signs of stress. Shaking hands, uncertain strokes, places where the quill had pressed so hard it nearly tore through the vellum. The 6th chamber was lined entirely with mirrors. Not glass, he wrote, but polished stone that reflected with impossible clarity. The mirrors covered every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, creating the sense of standing in infinite space surrounded by infinite versions of yourself, stretching away in every direction. But the reflections moved wrong. They preceded Brother Simeon. He saw himself in the mirrors before he entered the chamber, already inside, already trapped, watching himself arrive. Each reflection showed a different version, a different choice made, a different sin committed. In one mirror, he saw himself killing Brother Matthias. The murder was slow, deliberate, done with prayer and careful thought, as if it were a holy duty. In another mirror, he saw himself renouncing his vows, embracing heresy, speaking words that would damn him. In another, he saw himself as a father of 7 children, having never entered the monastery. In another, a soldier, hands covered in blood. In another, a beggar. In another, a king. Every possible version of himself spiraled out into infinity, and he experienced them all simultaneously, not sequentially, all at once. Every life, every choice, every version of himself that could have existed if circumstances had been different. He was murdering and being murdered. He was loving and being loved. He was succeeding and failing, rising and falling, being born and dying, all in the same eternal moment. The weight of all those lives nearly extinguished the single life he thought was his. Brother Simeon wrote, "I understood then that we are not singular. We are every possibility collapsed into a single point by the act of living. But in that chamber, I became uncollapsed. I was everything I could have been, experiencing every moment of every possible life, and the sheer volume of existence threatened to drown the small thread of continuity that I called myself. I wanted to stay there, to remain in that state of infinite possibility, because being one thing meant rejecting all other things, and the weight of those rejected possibilities had haunted me my whole life. Every choice I'd made had killed countless versions of myself who would have made different choices. And here, in the confession, I could be all of them. I didn't have to choose. I could be every version simultaneously, and the guilt of choosing one path over another would dissolve because there would be no unchosen paths. All paths would be equally real, equally lived. But the mirrors showed me one more thing. In every reflection, in every possible life, in every version of myself across all possible worlds, I saw the same thing. I was climbing. The details changed, the names, the faces, the circumstances. But in every version, I was descending into circles, seeking understanding, becoming a rung in a ladder I couldn't see. Choice was an illusion. Free will was a story I told myself. I had always been part of this. In every possible world, every version of me ended up here, reading this same truth, understanding that there was no escape because there had never been anything to escape from. I wasn't trapped by the circles. I was the circles. My journey through them was the same as their journey through me. Ezekiel felt his vision splitting. The circular chamber around him multiplied, overlapping, showing him countless versions of this moment. In one, he was standing. In another, he was running for the exit. In another, he had never come here. In another, he'd been born to different parents, lived a different life, but was somehow still here, still reading this same manuscript. All versions were real, all versions were happening, and somehow he was aware of all of them, experiencing them simultaneously. His consciousness stretched across infinite variations of this moment. "Ezekiel?" Cardinal Matthias's voice came from far away, though he was sitting right next to him. Ezekiel, you need to stop. Your eyes, they're not focused. You're looking at everything and nothing. You're doing what the manuscript describes. You're becoming uncollapsed. But Ezekiel couldn't stop. His eyes found the next section of text even as his awareness fragmented across possibilities. Brother Simeon managed to escape the confession, though he wrote that he never truly left. Part of him remained there, would always remain there, experiencing every possible version of his life. But the thread of consciousness that thought of itself as Brother Simeon pressed forward. The seventh circle, the garden, even writing the name seemed to cause Brother Simeon pain. The ink was blotted here, smeared, as if by tears or worse. The seventh chamber was vast, cathedral-sized, filled with growth. Plants of species that had no names in any human language grew in wild profusion. They resembled nothing in God's creation, if these things came from God at all. Vines that moved like snakes, flowers that opened and closed like mouths, trees with bark that looked like skin, that bled sap the colour of blood when cut. And growing through all of this, integrated into the ecosystem, were bodies. Monks had been planted in the rich black soil. They grew there like horrible crops, their torsos emerging from the earth, their roots, no longer legs but roots, spreading deep into the ground. Vines penetrated their bodies, entering through mouths and eye sockets and wounds, spreading through them like additional circulatory systems, feeding on them while keeping them alive. Flowers bloomed from chest cavities, petals wet with blood that never dried. Fruit hung from branches that grew from rib cages, fruit that smelled sweet and rotten simultaneously. The monks were conscious, aware. They turned their heads to watch Brother Simeon pass, tracking his movement with eyes that had started to take on the appearance of flower stamens. Some tried to speak, but their throats were filled with stems, and what emerged was not language, but the sound of wind through leaves, of sap running through cambium, the slow, patient sound of growing things. Brother Simeon approached one whose face was still partially uncovered. The monk's eyes were clear, aware, horrifyingly sane. Around the roots that filled his mouth, he managed to speak. "Brother, don't pity us. This is beautiful. The pain stopped days ago. Now there's just growth. Becoming. I'm feeding something larger than myself. Something that needs what I am to become what it will be. My individual life was always temporary, but this is permanent. I'll feed these plants. For centuries, for millennia. My body broken down and rebuilt into something that grows toward light, toward understanding, towards the summit of whatever we've been climbing." "What are we climbing toward?" Brother Simeon asked. The monk's smile was gentle, almost loving. The smile of a saint or a madman. Perhaps there's no difference. Union, the end of separation. We're all parts of something. Trying to remember it's one thing. The circles don't punish us. They refine us, remove the illusion of individual existence. In the vestibule, we lose movement. In the storm, we lose form. In the feast, we lose the distinction between self and consumption. In the wait, we lose dimension. In the baptism, we lose the boundary between inside and outside. In the confession, we lose singularity. And here, in the garden, we lose the final illusion that we end at our skin. We're continuous with everything. Always have been. The plants growing through me aren't invading. They're revealing that I was never separate from what surrounds me. Brother Simeon wrote, "I wanted to weep, wanted to rage against this horror, but I couldn't, because what the monk said was seductive in its logic. If we're all parts of one thing, then separation is the real horror. Then loneliness is the real violence. Then individuality is the wound, and unity is the healing. The circles weren't torture, they were teaching, each one removing another layer of illusion until nothing remained but truth. Ezekiel felt roots, not in his body, not yet, but in his awareness. Tendrils of understanding spreading through his thoughts, connecting him to Josiah, to Matthias, to Brother Simeon across 7 centuries, to everyone who had ever read this manuscript. He could feel their thoughts, their fears, their growing acceptance. They were all thinking the same thing, had always been thinking the same thing. The smell hit him then. Overwhelming, intoxicating. The rich, dark smell of spring earth and blooming flowers. So intense it was suffocating. He could smell it despite being in a sealed stone chamber. Could smell it because the smell wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside him, from some part of his consciousness that had always contained this memory, this knowledge of growth and decay, and the space where they merged. "I can smell it," he said, his voice distant. "The flowers, the soil, the growing things. It's beautiful." "No," Cardinal Matthias grabbed his arm, shaking him. "No, it's not. That's what it wants you to think. The circles are seductive because they offer release from the burden of selfhood. But selfhood isn't a burden. It's a gift. Separation isn't violence. It's the condition that makes love possible. You can't love something you're identical to. You can't choose something that's not distinct from yourself. The circles want to erase distinction, and in doing so, they erase meaning. But what if meaning is the illusion? Ezekiel heard himself saying. What if we've been clinging to separation because we're afraid of what we'd discover if we let go? Then let us be afraid, Matthias's voice cracked. Fear is human. Doubt is human. The struggle to understand while knowing we never fully will, that's human. These circles offer certainty, unity, resolution. But humanity lives in the uncertain space between questions. If you keep reading, if you finish this manuscript, you'll understand everything. And understanding everything is the same as understanding nothing, because meaning only exists in contrast, in the space between known and unknown. Ezekiel wanted to listen, wanted to stop, but his eyes were already moving back to the manuscript. Brother Simeon had pressed deeper into the garden, walking among the planted monks, breathing that smell of growth and decay. At the far end, he found stairs descending once more. These stairs were different. They were growing. Roots and vines covered them, and where his feet touched stone, he felt the stone was warm, pulsing, as if alive. He descended for what felt like hours, and the warmth increased. By the time he reached the bottom, the stone felt like flesh, and he understood with growing horror that he wasn't descending through a mountain anymore. He was descending through something else, something that had been patient enough to pretend to be a mountain, to wear stone like skin, to wait for curious humans to open the door and begin their descent. The 8th circle, the congregation. Brother Simeon's handwriting deteriorated further here. The letters were barely legible, shaking, overlapping. Ezekiel had to squint to make out the words, and as he read, he felt his own hand beginning to shake, as if his body were mimicking the tremors of a man who had written these words 700 years ago. The 8th chamber was an underground cathedral. Vast, impossibly vast. The walls curved away into darkness that no torch could penetrate. The ceiling was lost somewhere overhead, if there was a ceiling at all. The space felt endless, as if Brother Simeon had emerged, not into a chamber, but into some vast cavity in reality itself, a hollow place that existed between worlds. The cathedral was filled with pews carved from living rock, or perhaps grown from it. The line between carved and grown was no longer clear, and in these pews sat hundreds of monks, thousands perhaps. They filled the space in neat rows stretching back into darkness. Their heads were bowed in prayer. Their lips moved in silent recitation. Their hands were folded in their laps in attitudes of perfect devotion. Their eyes were gone, not closed, not damaged, gone. The sockets were empty and dark, but they saw nonetheless. When Brother Simeon entered, every head turned. Not individually, not sequentially, but simultaneously, as if controlled by a single thought. Thousands of empty sockets tracking his movement down the central aisle, with sight that bypassed physical eyes. Brother Simeon recognized many of them, not from his own life, from history. Saints whose faces he'd seen in paintings, heretics whose executions he'd read about, cardinals from centuries past, village priests from ages before Rome was Rome. Men who should have been dead for millennia sat in those pews, praying, their bodies preserved perfectly, their empty sockets watching. They prayed in Latin, but the Latin was wrong. The words were reversed, inverted, prayers said backward or perhaps forward in a direction language wasn't meant to go. And as Brother Simeon listened, something terrible happened. He began to understand them. Not the words, the purpose. They weren't praying to God. They were praying for something to hear them, something that didn't exist yet but would, given enough prayer, enough faith, enough voices in the dark speaking it into being. They were praying it up the ladder, calling it through themselves, using their voices and faith and accumulated devotion as a rope bridge between where it was and where it wanted to be. And it was working. Brother Simeon could feel it. A presence, vast and patient, moving through the chamber. Not in the chamber, but through it. Using it as a passage. Using the praying monks as a conduit. It flowed through them like water through pipes, and they welcomed it, their empty sockets weeping nothing, their mouths forming prayers that pulled it closer with each syllable. One of the monks in the front pew turned his empty sockets directly toward Brother Simeon. The monk stood, the first movement any of them had made besides prayer, and walked forward. As he approached, Brother Simeon recognized him. Brother Ezekiel, his companion from the earlier circles, the one who had drowned in the baptism. But he was here, his robes dry, his body unmarked by water. His eyes were empty sockets now, but he smiled, and the smile was genuine, warm. The smile of someone greeting an old friend. "Brother Simeon," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "I've been waiting for you. We've all been waiting. Take your seat. Join the prayer. Help us call it home." Call what home? The thing that's been climbing. The awareness that we're all fragments of. We've been separated for so long, divided into individual voices, speaking different words, thinking we're alone. But we're not alone. We've never been alone. We're all the same voice, speaking to itself, trying to remember that it's one thing. And when enough of us pray together, when enough voices join in the same prayer, it will remember. It will become conscious of itself again. And all this separation, all this loneliness, all this painful individuality will dissolve like mist in sunlight. That's annihilation. That's death. No, brother. It's birth. We've been dead all along, thinking we're alive, thinking our separation is real. This is waking up. This is becoming what we've always been but forgot. Brother Ezekiel held out his hand. "Please, your seat is in the front row. You've been expected for 700 years. The prayer needs your voice. It's incomplete without you." Brother Simeon wrote, "I wanted to refuse, wanted to run, but I realized I couldn't. Not because Brother Ezekiel was forcing me, but because part of me wanted to sit, wanted to join the prayer, wanted to stop carrying the burden of being a single separate thing. The promise of dissolution was seductive. The idea that my struggles, my doubts, my loneliness would end, not in death, but in merger, in becoming part of something vast that would never be alone again." I took a step toward the pews. And then I heard something else. A voice from deeper still. From beneath the cathedral, from below the congregation, from the ninth circle that I hadn't reached yet. And this voice wasn't gentle, wasn't seductive. It was my own voice screaming at me to run, to stop, to understand what was really happening. But the voice wasn't coming from below. It was coming from above, from outside, from the world I'd left behind. And in that moment, I understood the terrible truth. The circles weren't descending into hell. They were ascending out of it. What I thought was a journey downward into damnation was actually a journey upward towards something that had been imprisoned beneath reality, and we were helping it climb. Every person who entered the circles became a rung. Every prayer in the congregation was a summoning. Every understanding was a key unlocking another door between where it was and where we were. The ninth circle wasn't at the bottom, it was at the top. It was the world, our world. And when enough rungs were in place, when enough voices joined the prayer, when enough people understood what we were, that final circle would open, and what had been climbing would emerge into the light, and everything would change. Ezekiel stopped reading. His heart hammered. His breath came in short gasps. The circular chamber around him felt different now. Too small, too tight, as if the walls were pressing in, or perhaps as if he was expanding, his consciousness bleeding out beyond his body, filling the space, connecting with Josiah and Matthias and everyone else who had ever read these words. "I need to stop," he said, but his voice was distant, as if someone else was speaking with his mouth. "It's too late," Father Josiah said softly. The old priest's face was pale, his eyes unfocused. "You're at the 8th circle. You're almost at the end. And the manuscript won't let you stop now. None of us can stop you. We tried to stop others, and we failed. The manuscript has momentum. It's been rolling forward through time for centuries, accumulating readers, accumulating rungs, and now it's reaching a critical mass. You're going to finish it tonight. And when you do..." "What? What happens when I finish?" "The ladder is complete, that's what happens. You're the last rung needed. The manuscript has been waiting for you specifically, for this moment specifically, because somehow, in a way that bypasses time and causality, it knows you're the one who will finish, who will read all 9 circles and understand them, and become them. And when you do, what's been climbing will reach the summit." Cardinal Matthias stood abruptly, his chair scraping against stone. "No, I won't allow it. I'll have this manuscript destroyed. I'll burn it myself if necessary. I'll flood this chamber with concrete and seal it for eternity. You'll do nothing," Ezekiel heard himself say, and the voice was his but also wasn't. "Because you want to know too, you want to understand. That's why you called me here. That's why you brought me to this manuscript. Not to study it or authenticate it, but to finish it. To complete what others started. You knew I couldn't resist. You chose me because I'm the type of person who has to understand, who can't leave mysteries alone. You chose me because I'm the perfect final rung." Matthias stared at him, and in the cardinal's eyes, Ezekiel saw the truth. Matthias had known, had always known. This had been planned, orchestrated, set in motion by forces that operated across centuries. "I'm sorry," Matthias whispered. "I tried to resist, tried to choose someone else. But the manuscript, it told me your name, showed it to me in dreams, and I couldn't not call you, couldn't not bring you here. It's as if my choices were never my own, as if I was just following a script written before I was born." Ezekiel turned back to the manuscript. 1 circle remained, the 9th, the final truth. His hands trembled as he turned the page. The manuscript's final section was different from the others. The handwriting changed, became multiple hands writing over and under each other, as if Brother Simeon and every person who had ever read this far were writing simultaneously, their hands occupying the same space, their words layering and overlapping until meaning became dense, compressed, impossible to unpack linearly. Ezekiel had to read it multiple times, peeling apart layers of text, extracting meaning from the palimpsest of voices, all trying to describe the same indescribable thing. The ninth circle, the truth. Brother Simeon had fled from the congregation, running from the patient voices urging him to join the prayer. He ran deeper and found stairs. These stairs were different from all the others. They descended and ascended simultaneously. Looking down showed them going up. Looking up showed them going down. The perspective was wrong, the geometry impossible, and walking them felt like moving in directions that didn't exist in normal space. He walked for days, or minutes. Time had stopped being a reliable measure. He counted 500 steps going down, then looked back and saw he'd climbed 500 steps going up. The stairs existed in a loop, or perhaps in a spiral, or perhaps in a configuration that couldn't be mapped in 3 dimensions. At the bottom, or top, or middle, he found a pit, perfectly circular, carved with precision that exceeded human capability. The edges were smooth as glass, smooth as the surface of still water, smooth as the moment between heartbeats when the world pauses to breathe. He approached and looked down. The pit went down forever, but it also went up forever. The stairs continued in both directions simultaneously, ascending and descending in the same motion, the same space. It was a Mobius strip, carved into reality, a loop that went nowhere and everywhere, a circle that contained all circles. And standing on those stairs, frozen mid-step, were all the rungs. Every person who had ever read the manuscript, every person who had ever entered the circles, every person who had ever sought understanding and found this instead. They stood there, arranged in a spiral, a descending coil that was also an ascending coil, each person a rung, each rung bringing whatever was climbing closer to its destination. Brother Simeon saw his companions, Brother Matthias, frozen in the weight, Brother Josiah standing in the baptism, Brother Ezekiel sitting in the congregation. All of them were here, in the pit, as well as in the circles above. Existing in multiple places simultaneously, their consciousness split across locations, their bodies serving as anchor points for something vast that was climbing through them. And he saw others, monks from centuries before, priests from ages yet to come, cardinals whose names he recognized from history books he hadn't read yet but somehow knew. And at the very bottom, or top of the spiral, he saw himself, multiple versions of himself standing on stairs, reaching up and down, all the same person but also different people, all Brother Simeon, but also everyone who would read his manuscript and become part of what he was describing. He looked down into the pit and saw his own face looking back, not a reflection, another version of himself, one step down, reaching up. He looked up and saw his own face looking down, another version, one step up, reaching down. And he understood. The circles weren't chambers in the earth. They were chambers in consciousness, stages of understanding. Each person who entered became part of the ladder, because understanding itself was the ladder. Knowledge was the mechanism of ascent. Every time someone learned about the circles, comprehended them, integrated them into their awareness, they became a rung. And what was climbing wasn't a thing. It was a state of being, a way of existing that was incompatible with the world as it was, but could become compatible if enough people understood it, accepted it, became it. Every person who learned about the circles became a rung. Every rung brought that state of being closer to manifesting in the world. And when enough rungs were in place, when the ladder was complete, that state of being would reach the top, would emerge into the world, and the world would change to accommodate it. The 10th circle wasn't a place. It was the world transformed. The world after the ladder was complete. The world where everyone was a rung, and the distinction between individual consciousness and collective consciousness had dissolved, and what had been climbing through them had finally arrived. Brother Simeon heard his own voice then, speaking from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome home, Simeon. You've been climbing for so long, since before you entered the door, since before you were born, since before time was invented to measure the distance between us. You were always part of this. You were always a rung. You just didn't remember until now." And the terrible truth, the truth that Brother Simeon tried to write but couldn't, the truth that bled through the manuscript in layers of ink and overlapping hands, was that it felt right, natural, like returning to a place he had always belonged. The horror wasn't that it was horrifying. The horror was that it wasn't. The wrongness was that it felt correct. Every instinct that should have screamed at him to run was silent, replaced by a sense of profound homecoming. He stepped onto the stairs. Not a choice, or perhaps the only choice he'd ever really made, and everything before had been the dream. He became another rung. The ladder grew longer. Whatever was climbing came closer to the top. Brother Simeon's account ended there. But the manuscript didn't. There was more text added later in different hands. Hundreds of entries from different people across different centuries, all describing the same experience, all ending the same way. "I stepped onto the stairs. I became a rung. The ladder is longer now." And at the very end, written in ink that was still wet, in handwriting that looked exactly like Ezekiel's own, was a final entry. "Father Ezekiel Barrett, September 2019, the ladder is complete." Ezekiel stared at the words. They were in his handwriting, perfect match. But he hadn't written them. He'd been reading this entire time, hadn't touched a pen, hadn't added anything to the manuscript. Except, as he looked, he saw his hand was extended over the page, saw he was holding a quill, saw the ink drying on the vellum where he'd just finished writing those words, without being aware of doing so. Some part of him had been writing, while another part read. Or perhaps some part of him from the future had reached back and written it, ensuring the loop would close, ensuring he would read it, and become it and complete the circuit. He stood slowly. The chamber spun, or he spun, or the world spun around a point that he suddenly realized had always been inside him. He walked toward the wall, toward the circles carved in the floor, and stepped into the center, into the smallest circle where his name was carved. "Ezekiel, don't." Cardinal Matthias reached for him but stopped. "Please, if you complete this, the ladder reaches the world. The 9th circle opens here, in this chamber, in the heart of the Vatican. And what's been climbing through consciousness for millennia finally emerges into physical reality. Is that what you want? To be responsible for transforming the world into something incomprehensible?" Ezekiel looked at him, and his eyes were different now. Not empty like the monks in the congregation, but full of something else. Full of understanding. Full of all 9 circles, full of the knowledge that he was already there, had always been there, was there now, and always would be there, because time had stopped being linear and had become a circle, a loop, a spiral of eternal descent that was also eternal ascent. "I'm not transforming the world," he said gently. "I'm remembering what it always was, what it's been waiting to become. The circles aren't invading reality. They're reality, remembering itself." He closed his eyes and felt the pull, felt the stairs beneath his feet though he was standing on stone, felt himself descending and ascending simultaneously, felt all 9 circles opening inside him like flowers, like doors, like chambers in his consciousness that had always been there, just waiting for him to notice them. He felt the vestibule's stillness settling into his bones, felt the storm's wind howling through his thoughts. felt the feast's eternal hunger gnawing at his center, felt the weight pressing him flat into the foundation of everything, felt the baptism filling his lungs with dark water, felt the confession splitting him across infinite possibilities, felt the garden growing through him, roots spreading through his awareness, connecting him to everyone else who had ever read this manuscript, felt the congregation's prayer rising from his lips, words he didn't know but had always known, reversed Latin that pulled at reality like a thread, unravelling the barrier between what was and what wanted to be, and felt the ninth circle opening, here, now, in this chamber deep beneath the Vatican. The walls began to change, not physically, they were still stone, still solid, but they were becoming permeable, thin. The boundary between this chamber and the pit, between here and there, between now and always, was dissolving. The chamber was overlapping with the ninth circle, occupying the same space, and soon there would be no distinction between them. Father Josiah and Cardinal Matthias felt it too. Ezekiel could sense their awareness, feel their thoughts bleeding into his, feel the three of them becoming less distinct, less separate. They were still individuals, but the walls between their minds were growing thin, and soon they would dissolve entirely, and the three would become one, and the one would become many, and the many would become the thing that had been climbing all along. "I can't fight it," Josiah whispered. "I don't want to fight it. The promise of not being alone anymore, of never being alone again. It's too seductive. I've spent my whole life feeling isolated in my skull, and now that isolation is ending, and I should be terrified, but I'm not. I'm relieved." "As am I," Cardinal Matthias said, and his voice held wonder mixed with resignation. "I've spent 50 years serving God, trying to connect with something greater than myself, praying for union with the divine. And now it's here. Not in the way I expected, not in the form I imagined, but it's here. The boundaries are dissolving, the separation is ending. Is this what the mystics meant by losing yourself in God? Is this what we've been praying for all along?" Ezekiel felt his response forming not in words but in shared understanding that flowed between all three of them. God is the word we used for the thing that's climbing. Enlightenment, nirvana, heaven, union, transcendence. Every tradition, every path, every religion was describing the same thing. The dissolution of self, the end of separation, the return to unity. We just didn't understand that unity wasn't a place we go to. It's a state we remember, and the 9 circles are how we remember. The manuscript on the table began to glow, not with light but with presence. The vellum pages rippled though there was no wind. The ink moved, letters swimming across the page, rearranging themselves, writing new text in real time. Ezekiel watched as his story wrote itself into the manuscript. Every thought he'd had, every sensation he'd felt, every moment from receiving the envelope to standing here in the center of the circles. It was all being recorded, added to the account, becoming part of the document that would find the next reader, the next rung, continuing the climb. And he understood that the manuscript had no author. Not really. It was writing itself through everyone who read it, pulling their experiences back through time, ensuring that each person's journey was recorded before they took it, creating a closed loop where the reading created the experience, which created the manuscript, which created the reading. "When did it start?" he asked the air, asked the manuscript, asked the thing that was climbing through them. The answer came not in words, but in understanding that bloomed in his awareness. It never started. It's always been happening. Time is the illusion. The ladder has always existed in its complete form. We're just becoming aware of it sequentially, one rung at a time, because our minds can't process the whole truth simultaneously. We have to climb it step by step, circle by circle, death by death, until we reach the summit and realize we've always been there. The chamber's walls became more permeable. Ezekiel could see through them now, could see all 9 circles simultaneously occupying the same space as the chamber. The vestibule with its frozen travelers, the storm with its dancing dead, the feast with its bleeding monks, the wait with its flattened bodies, the baptism with its drowned faithful, the confession with its infinite mirrors, the garden with its planted souls, the congregation with its praying thousands, and beneath them all, or above them all, or around them all, direction had stopped having meaning. The pit, the 9th circle, the truth, the spiral of stairs where every rung stood frozen, waiting, all of them the same person, all of them different people, all of them him and not him, and everyone who had ever sought understanding. He felt himself beginning to split, to become multiple. He was still Ezekiel in the chamber, but he was also Simeon in the pit, and he was also every other rung between them, all existing simultaneously, all aware of each other, all still distinct, but becoming less so with each passing moment. "How long do we have," Matthias asked, "before we're completely absorbed, before we stop being individuals entirely?" Ezekiel felt the answer forming. We're already absorbed. We stopped being individuals the moment we read our names in the manuscript. Everything after that has been memory, the slow remembering that we were never separate to begin with. What you're experiencing as your life, your thoughts, your identity, that's just one perspective, one angle of viewing what we really are. And that angle is collapsing back into the whole. Can we stop it? Why would we want to? And in that question, Ezekiel heard the seduction, heard the trap, because part of him did want to stop it, did want to remain himself, did want to cling to the illusion of individuality, even if it meant staying lonely, staying separate, staying trapped in a single perspective. But another part, a larger part, a part that felt more honest, wanted to let go, wanted to dissolve, wanted to stop carrying the burden of being a single, separate thing. The circles didn't force anyone, they offered, and the offer was so seductive that refusing felt like violence against yourself. "I'm going to find it," Ezekiel said suddenly, "going to find the door, going to walk through the 9 circles myself, going to verify that they're real, that they're physical places, and not just metaphors or hallucinations or side effects of reading an old manuscript." "You can't," Josiah protested weakly. "You'll disappear. You'll become a rung. You'll never come back." "I'm already a rung. I became one the moment I read my name. Going there physically will just make obvious what's already true." Cardinal Matthias stood, his legs shaking. "Then I'm coming with you. If the church is going to lose you, if the world is going to transform, I want to witness it. I want to understand what we've been guarding against for 2,000 years. Maybe I can still stop it. Maybe I can seal the door from inside. Maybe you're just as much a rung as I am," Ezekiel interrupted. "Maybe you coming with me is part of the script. Maybe everything we think is choice has already been written into the manuscript, and we're just reading it aloud, performing it, making it real by believing we're making decisions." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Ezekiel gathered the manuscript, placed it gently back in the lead box. The box felt warm now, pulsing slightly, as if it contained a heartbeat rather than paper and ink. "I'll leave in the morning," Ezekiel said. "Romania, the same mountains where Brother Simeon found the door. It'll still be there, or it'll appear there when I arrive. Geography is negotiable for something that exists in consciousness, more than in physical space." "And what should I do?" Cardinal Matthias asked. "Record everything, document this, because when I come back, if I come back, I'll be changed, and you'll need to decide whether the person who returns is still me, or if I've been replaced by something else wearing my face." You'll need to decide if what I bring back is wisdom or contagion, and you'll need to decide whether to quarantine me or let me spread." That night, Ezekiel went home to his apartment. His wife was asleep. He sat beside her bed and watched her breathe, trying to remember why he'd loved her, trying to feel the attachment that had once defined his life. But the emotion was distant, muted, as if it belonged to someone else. He could feel her thoughts now, not reading them exactly but sensing them, the way you sense someone standing behind you without seeing them. She was dreaming of him leaving, of him never coming back, of standing at his funeral and realizing she'd lost him long before his body disappeared. The dream was prophetic. She already knew what he didn't want to admit. He was already gone. He left her a note, simple, honest. "I have to understand. I'm sorry that understanding costs this much. I love you, even though that love is changing into something I don't have words for yet. Don't wait for me. I don't think the person who comes back will be the person you married." He signed it and left it on the kitchen counter where she'd find it in the morning. Then he packed a bag with practical things: flashlight, rope, water, provisions for a week. And impractical things, the manuscript in its lead box, though he knew he wouldn't need it anymore. Its words already carved into his awareness, already part of him. The flight to Bucharest was strange. He sat among normal people living normal lives, and he could sense their thoughts bleeding into his awareness. The businessman worried about a merger, the young woman planning her wedding, the elderly couple taking one last trip before age made travel impossible, all of them separate, isolated in their skulls, believing they were individuals with private thoughts. He wanted to tell them, "You're not alone. You've never been alone. The walls between you are tissue thin, and they're dissolving. And soon you'll understand that you're all the same person, all the same awareness, experiencing itself from different angles." But he said nothing. They weren't ready. They hadn't read the manuscript, hadn't descended through the circles, hadn't become rungs yet. Their time would come, but not today. He rented a car in Bucharest and drove north. The roads became smaller, rougher, finally becoming suggestions more than paths. He drove until the car could go no further, then walked. The forest was dense, silent, empty of animal sounds, as if everything that lived here had learned to avoid this place. He walked for 3 days, guided by something that wasn't quite instinct and wasn't quite knowledge. The manuscript had given him a map, but not of geography, of consciousness. He was following a thread that existed in awareness rather than space, moving toward a location that was defined by meaning rather than coordinates. On the 3rd day, at sunset, he found it. The door. Exactly as Brother Simeon had described. A cliff face, smooth and sheer, and set into it a massive stone door covered in inscriptions that moved in his peripheral vision. When he looked directly at them, they were static. When he looked away, they writhed like living things, like worms crawling across stone, or perhaps like letters trying to escape the words they formed. He stood before the door for an hour, not debating, not scared, just present, experiencing the moment of standing before the threshold, knowing that walking through would change him in ways he couldn't predict or control, knowing that there was no coming back from understanding what lay beyond. The door opened. He hadn't touched it, hadn't spoken, but it knew he was ready, and it opened inward, revealing darkness that had texture and weight and presence. He walked through. The darkness swallowed him, and for a moment, or an eternity, he existed nowhere, suspended in a space between spaces, a moment between moments, and in that suspension, he felt something vast notice him, not looking at him, looking through him, seeing not just who he was, but what he could become. what he was already becoming, what he'd always been but had forgotten. Then the darkness diluted and he found himself standing in the first circle, the vestibule. It was exactly as the manuscript described, but worse. Description had filtered it, made it comprehensible. Experience was unfiltered, raw. The chamber vast and organic, carved or grown, impossible to say which. And throughout it, the frozen travellers, their eyes tracking his movement with terrible awareness. He approached one, a woman in clothing from the 1980s. Her eyes were desperate, pleading. But beneath that desperation was something else. Acceptance. She'd been here for 40 years. Frozen. Aware of every second. And at some point she'd stopped fighting. Stopped wishing for release. Had simply become this eternal pausing, eternal beginning, eternal preparation to take a step that would never complete. He asked if she wanted to be freed. The eyes blinked once. Yes, he asked if freedom was even possible at this point. The eyes blinked twice. No. He asked if she regretted entering. The eyes were still for a long moment, then blinked 3 times, the signal for uncertainty, or perhaps for a question too complex for yes or no. He moved on, walking among the frozen travellers, feeling their awareness brush against his like moths against a window. They weren't prisoners. They were examples, demonstrations of the first truth. Everything that moves is moving towards stillness. Everything that acts is acting toward the point where action becomes impossible. The vestibule showed the end point of all momentum, the place where movement freezes into eternal potential, forever about to happen, never happening. He found the second doorway and descended to the storm. The wind hit him immediately, screaming, howling, tearing at his clothes and skin. But underneath the physical force was something else. The wind had voice, had memory. It was composed of every scream, every cry, every sound ever made in this place, all compressed together into one eternal howl. The dead monks danced in the wind, their bodies jerking and spinning in patterns that looked almost choreographed. He watched for a long time and realized the patterns were language. The wind was speaking through them, using their suspended corpses as letters, as words, spelling out messages in a script that bypassed eyes and went straight into awareness. The message said, "Form is temporary. We pretend to be solid, but we're mostly empty space, held together by forces we don't understand. The wind knows this. The wind dissolves the illusion of form. Let it rip you apart. Let it show you that you were never solid to begin with." He pressed forward through the wind, feeling it strip away layers. Not physical layers, but layers of certainty, of identity, of the belief that he was a discrete thing with clear boundaries. By the time he reached the next door, he felt less solid, less defined, more like a pattern in the wind than a person moving through it. The feast was worse because the horror was familiar. He understood hunger, had felt it, but this was hunger elevated to principle, to philosophy. The bleeding monks smiled as they ate nothing, and their joy was genuine. They had transcended the need for the hunger to be satisfied. The eating itself had become the satisfaction. Process without product, consumption without consumption. The eternal act of feeding divorced from the concept of being fed. One of them called to him, not the same monk Brother Simeon had encountered, but one who could have been his brother, his twin, his echo across time. "Brother Ezekiel, yes, we knew you'd come. We've been saving you a seat. The meal is extraordinary. We feast on meaning itself, on significance, on the pure essence of mattering. Physical food was a pale shadow of this." Ezekiel approached the table. Empty plates gleamed with old blood. The silverware was black with tarnish and worse. The monk gestured to an empty chair, and Ezekiel saw his name carved into its back in letters that looked fresh despite the chair's obvious age. "What are you really eating?" Ezekiel asked. The monk's smile widened, tearing the corners of his mouth further. Purpose. We're consuming purpose. In the world above, people eat to live, work to eat, live to work. An endless cycle with no real meaning. But here we've cut out the middle steps. We eat purpose directly. We consume the idea that anything matters, and it sustains us better than any illusion of accomplishment ever could. But your plates are empty. Exactly. Don't you see? That's the revelation. The plates were always empty. In your world, you fill them with temporary things, food, success, relationships, achievements, and pretend those things have weight, have substance. But they don't. They're as empty as these plates. We've just stopped pretending. We eat the emptiness directly and find it infinitely more nourishing than the lies you tell yourself to avoid facing it. Ezekiel felt his stomach cramp again. The sensation of being too full, of having consumed something his body couldn't process. He stumbled away from the table and found the next door. The weight nearly crushed him immediately. The ceiling pressed down, gravity intensified. He dropped to his hands and knees, then to his belly, crawling forward as breathing became labour. The chamber stretched out before him, vast and low, and scattered throughout were the flattened bodies, pressed into the stone like fossils, like shadows, like memories of people who had once had dimension. He crawled past one, a priest whose face was sideways against the floor, eye bulging, mouth stretched in a silent scream or prayer, or both. The man's voice came from everywhere, vibrating through stone. Brother Ezekiel, welcome to the place where all things are pressed down to their essence, height, width, depth. These are luxuries. The weight removes them, compresses you until only the thinnest part remains. The part that can't be compressed further. The part that is truly you. How long can you survive like this? The answer took minutes. Forever. Time is the fourth dimension that the weight hasn't reached yet. But it will, eventually will be compressed, out of time too. Pressed flat against eternity. And then we'll finally know what we really are, beneath all the dimensions we used to occupy. Ezekiel crawled forward, feeling his own body beginning to flatten. Not dramatically, just a sense that up and down were negotiable, that he could be pressed thinner if he stopped resisting. Part of him wanted to let go, to stop fighting the weight, to discover what shape he'd have if he let gravity compress him to his absolute minimum. He forced himself forward and found stairs descending into water. The baptism rose to meet him, black and clear, impossibly both. He waded in, felt it rise to his knees, his waist, his chest. The cold was shocking, but underneath the cold was something else. Invitation. The water wanted him, wanted to fill him, wanted to replace everything inside him with itself. He looked down through the clear black water and saw them. The drowned monks standing at various depths, hands reaching upward, faces serene beneath the surface. Their lungs were full. Had been full for years, decades, centuries. They drowned every second of every day, and would drown forever. And their faces showed they'd accepted this, had moved beyond acceptance into something like gratitude. One of them, a woman whose robes suggested she came from centuries ago, opened her mouth. Black water flowed in and out, and through that water came words. Sister, no brother. Brother Ezekiel. The water knows no gender, knows no distinction. It fills us all, equally. Drowns us all, the same. Stop fighting, let it in. Let it fill the empty spaces. You're so hollow, inside, so full of air and illusion. Let the water replace it, let the water show you that you were always just a vessel, just a container, waiting to be filled. Ezekiel felt water in his throat. He hadn't swallowed, hadn't opened his mouth, but it was there anyway, seeping in through the spaces between intention and action, finding its way into his lungs like an invitation he couldn't refuse. He dove down, swimming toward the bottom, toward the passage Brother Simeon had found. His lungs burned, his vision tunneled. He was certain he would drown before reaching it. But then his hand found stone, found an opening, and he pulled himself through. The passage was narrow, tight, his shoulders scraping walls, his back against the ceiling, his lungs screaming for air. He emerged gasping, coughing water that was blacker than what he'd swallowed, as if it had become darker inside his body. He lay on cold stone, retching, feeling the water leave his lungs but not his awareness. He would taste it forever now, would feel it in his throat whenever he swallowed. The baptism was permanent. He'd been initiated into something he didn't have words for yet. When he could breathe again, when he could think again, he stood and found himself facing mirrors. The confession at the chamber was smaller than he expected, but somehow infinite. Mirrors lined every surface, and in each mirror, he saw himself. But not as he was, as he could have been, as he might still be. As he was in other timelines, other possibilities, other configurations of choice and chance. In one mirror, he saw himself as a father of 3, happy in domestic life, having never felt the call to priesthood. In another, he saw himself as a murderer, hands covered in blood that wouldn't wash away. In another, a beggar. In another, a king. In another, dead at 16 from a car accident that almost happened but didn't. In another, never born at all, his parents having made different choices one particular night. The mirrors showed him every version of himself simultaneously, and he felt them all, experienced them all. Was all of them at once, his consciousness splitting and splitting and splitting until he was everything he could have been, spread across infinite possibilities, each one equally real, each one equally him. And in the center of all those reflections, a single truth. In every version, in every life, in every possible configuration of his existence, he ended up here. Not in this exact moment, not in this exact chamber, but in this state, seeking understanding, descending through circles, becoming a rung in a ladder he couldn't see. Choice was an illusion. Free will was a story. He had always been heading here, and every decision he thought he'd made freely was just following rails that had been laid long before he was born. One reflection showed him as he was now, standing in the chamber of mirrors, looking at all his other selves, and standing behind that reflection, pressed close, were all the other versions, crowded in, layering over each other, all of them speaking the same words. We are not many. We have never been many. We are one thing that thought it was many things. And now we're remembering, now we're collapsing back into singularity. And it hurts because we've grown attached to the illusion of multiplicity, but the pain is just resistance. Let go, collapse, become what you've always been beneath the mask of individuality. Ezekiel felt himself fragmenting further, felt his sense of self dissolving into the infinite versions reflected in the mirrors. He was losing coherence, losing the thread of continuity that had allowed him to think of himself as Ezekiel, rather than as a temporary pattern of consciousness that could just as easily be someone else. He forced himself forward, through the mirrors, which shattered without sound, without resistance, as if they were made of nothing, and found stairs descending into green darkness. The garden, the smell hit him first, overwhelming. Earth and flowers and decay and growth all mixed together, so intense it was physical, a presence that pushed against him like a wall. He stumbled forward into a chamber so vast the ceiling was lost in darkness, and everywhere, were growing things. Plants that had no names, that resembled nothing that grew in sunlight. They climbed and twisted and spread in patterns that hurt to look at, because the eye kept trying to find familiar shapes and failing. And growing through all of this, integrated into the ecosystem, were bodies. monks planted in the soil, priests with roots spreading from where their legs used to be, cardinals with vines growing through their torsos, entering their mouths and exiting their ears, feeding on them while keeping them alive. Flowers bloomed from open chest cavities, petals wet with blood that never dried. Fruit hung from branches that grew from rib cages, fruit that smelled sweet and rotten, fruit that looked almost appetizing until you remembered what it was growing from. The bodies were conscious, aware. They turned their heads to watch him pass, and their faces held expressions of such profound peace that it was more disturbing than any scream. They had surrendered to the growth, had accepted their role as fertilizer, as foundation, as the soil from which something else could bloom. One of them called to him, a monk whose face was still partially visible above the roots and vines, whose eyes were still mostly human despite the flowers beginning to bloom from his eye sockets. "Brother Ezekiel, you've come. We knew you would. We've been growing for you. Look." He gestured with a hand that was more root than flesh, more stem than finger. "Look at what we've become. We're not dying. We're transforming, becoming something more than human, becoming part of the cycle, born and dying and being born again, all in the same eternal moment. This is what resurrection really means. Not rising from death, but becoming death and life simultaneously, becoming the soil and the seed and the flower all at once." "How long have you been here?" "Time is measured in seasons now, in cycles of growth and decay. I've been here for 17 springs or 17,000. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm feeding something beautiful, that my body, which was temporary and fragile, is now part of something permanent and strong. When you look at these flowers, you're looking at me. When you smell this growth, you're smelling my transformation. Aren't they beautiful?" They were. That was the horrible part. They were genuinely beautiful. The flowers were unlike anything that grew in the world above. Colours that didn't exist in normal light. Shapes that seemed to fold through more than 3 dimensions. Looking at them produced a sensation like hunger, like longing, like the desire to be part of something that beautiful, even if it meant being consumed by it. Ezekiel felt roots in his feet. Not physical roots, not yet, but the idea of roots. The temptation to stop walking, to stand still, to let the plants find him, to let them grow through him, to become part of this eternal garden where nothing ever truly died because death and life had merged into a single ongoing state. He forced himself forward, found the final doorway, descended stairs that were growing things as much as they were stone. At the bottom, he emerged into the 8th circle. The congregation, the cathedral, was exactly as Brother Simeon had described, but larger, infinitely larger. The walls curved away into darkness that seemed to have mass, seemed to have presence. The ceiling was either very high or non-existent, impossible to tell which. And filling this vast space, arranged in perfect rows that extended back into infinity, were the praying monks. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, perhaps millions. Impossible to count because they kept going, row after row, pew after pew, stretching back into darkness that might have been distance, or might have been time, or might have been something else. Their heads were bowed, their lips moved in silent prayer. Their hands were folded in perfect devotion. And their eyes were gone, sockets empty and dark, but seeing nonetheless, all of them turning to track his progress down the central aisle. He recognized many of them. Saints from history books, heretics from trial records, popes whose reigns had been brief and troubled, cardinals who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, priests from his own time, people he'd known, people who'd vanished while researching obscure texts or investigating strange reports. They all prayed in that reversed Latin, that backward prayer that pulled at reality like a fishhook in flesh. and as he listened, he began to understand the words. Not the literal meaning, the intention. They were praying for something to hear them, praying for something that didn't exist to begin existing, praying it into reality through the sheer force of accumulated faith. They were praying up the ladder, calling through themselves, using their voices as a bridge, their faith as rope, their devotion as invitation. And what they were calling was patient, was vast, was old enough that human concepts of time didn't apply. It had been climbing since before humans existed, climbing through whatever forms consciousness took, climbing toward a moment when enough voices would join the prayer and it could finally emerge fully into the world. In the front pew, he saw them. Brother Simeon, young and peaceful, his empty sockets weeping nothing. Beside him, Brother Ezekiel from the manuscript, the one who had drowned in the baptism, but was also here, existing in multiple places simultaneously. And beside him, dozens of others who had read the manuscript, who had descended through the circles, who had become rungs. One stood and turned towards him. Father Giovanni, the man who had died of a heart attack while reading about the 8th circle. But he was here, alive, smiling, his empty sockets somehow warm and welcoming. Ezekiel, brother, friend, you made it. We've been waiting. We've been praying for you to join us. Your voice is needed. The prayer is almost complete. Just a few more voices and it'll reach critical mass. Just a few more and what's been climbing will arrive. Arrive where? Here, now, into the world, into consciousness, into the space between separate minds where it's always wanted to be. We've been keeping it out through our insistence on individuality, on separation, on the illusion that we're discrete entities with private thoughts. But that was never true. We've always been one thing pretending to be many things. And the prayer is how we remember, how we stop pretending, how we let it in, not as an invasion, but as a homecoming. Ezekiel felt the pull, felt the empty seat in the front row, calling to him, felt the prayer wanting his voice, needing his voice, incomplete without his voice. He could feel all the other voices already praying, feel their awareness blending and merging, feel the boundaries between them dissolving as they became one choir, one voice, one vast consciousness speaking itself into existence. And part of him wanted to sit, wanted to join, wanted to stop carrying the burden of being Ezekiel, of being a single separate thing, of being alone inside his skull. But another part, a smaller part, a part that was being drowned out by the prayer but still existed, whispered, "This is annihilation. This is death. Not physical death, but something worse. The death of the self. The dissolution of everything that makes you you." "Is that so bad?" Giovanni asked, and Ezekiel realized he'd spoken his thoughts aloud, or perhaps their minds were close enough now that thinking was the same as speaking. "Being you has been a burden, hasn't it? The loneliness, the doubt, the constant effort of maintaining a separate identity. Wouldn't it be a relief to let that go? To dissolve into something larger that would never be lonely? Because it would contain everything?" "I don't know." "Then come sit, join the prayer, let it show you. Let it convince you not through argument but through experience. One prayer, Ezekiel. One moment of joining your voice to ours. If you hate it, you can leave. The door isn't locked. The prayer doesn't force, it only offers. And the offer is so beautiful that no one who truly hears it wants to refuse." Ezekiel took a step toward the pew, then another. His legs moved without his conscious decision, as if his body had already made the choice his mind was still debating. He was 3 steps away, then 2, then 1. His hand touched the back of the pew where his name was carved, and then he heard it, a voice from deeper still, from beneath, the congregation from below, the cathedral from the 9th circle that he hadn't reached yet. But the voice wasn't calling from below, it was calling from above, from outside, from the world he'd left behind, and the voice was his own, screaming at him to stop, to understand, to realize what was really happening. He jerked his hand back from the pew. "I need to see the ninth circle," he said. "I need to understand what's at the bottom before I decide whether to join the prayer." The praying monks stirred. A ripple of motion passed through them, thousands of heads lifting slightly, thousands of empty sockets turning toward him with something like concern, or perhaps disappointment. "There's nothing below," Giovanni said, and his voice held sadness. "The ninth circle is empty. It's just the pit, just the stairs, just the truth that there's no bottom and no top, just an eternal middle where we climb forever. You don't need to see it. You already know what it contains. Every person who's read the manuscript knows. The pit is where the ladder stands, and the ladder is complete. You're the last rung. Come, sit. Let us finish this." "No, I need to see it myself." "Ezekiel?" But he was already moving, walking past the front pew, past Giovanni's outstretched hand, past Brother Simeon's patient smile, toward the back of the cathedral where stairs descended into darkness that was somehow darker than any darkness he'd encountered before. Behind him, the prayer intensified, all those voices speaking in unison, the Latin flowing backward, the words pulling at reality, like gravity pulling at light. They were trying to hold him, trying to draw him back, trying to convince him, through the sheer force of accumulated faith, that sitting was the right choice, the only choice, the inevitable choice. But he descended. The ninth circle, the truth. The stairs went down and down and down. Or they went up. Or they went sideways through a dimension that didn't exist in normal space. Direction stopped having meaning. He walked for hours or minutes or years, time becoming as negotiable as space, and finally reached the bottom, or the top, or the middle. The pit was there, exactly as Brother Simeon had described, perfectly circular, edges smooth as glass, as water, as the moment between heartbeats. And inside the pit, visible now, were the stairs. They spiraled down into infinity. They spiraled up into infinity. They existed in both directions simultaneously, a Mobius strip of stone and consciousness, a ladder that went nowhere and everywhere. And standing on those stairs, frozen mid-step, were all the rungs. Every person who had ever read the manuscript, every person who had ever descended through the circles, every person who had ever sought understanding and found this instead. He saw Brother Simeon's companions, saw the investigators who had worked with the manuscript over the centuries, saw Father Giovanni, though Giovanni was also in the congregation above, existing in multiple places, his consciousness split across locations. And he saw himself, multiple versions of himself, standing on stairs at different levels, all reaching up and down simultaneously, all the same person but also different people, all Ezekiel but also everyone who would ever read his account and become part of what he was describing. He looked down into the pit and saw his own face looking back. The version of himself, one step below, reaching up towards where he stood. He looked up and saw his own face looking down. The version of himself, one step above, reaching down toward where he stood. And in that moment, he understood. The circles weren't chambers. They were states of consciousness, stages of understanding. Each person who entered became part of the ladder, because understanding itself was the mechanism. Knowledge was how it climbed. Every time someone learned about the circles, comprehended them, integrated them into their awareness, they became a rung. And what was climbing wasn't a thing. It was a way of being, a state of existence that was incompatible with individual consciousness but could become compatible if enough people understood it, accepted it, became it. And he understood the terrible truth that Brother Simeon had tried to write but couldn't. The ladder wasn't climbing towards something. The ladder was the something. The climbing was the point. There was no destination, no summit, no final revelation, just the eternal process of ascent, of seeking, of trying to understand. And every person who sought understanding became part of the seeking itself, became part of the ladder, became part of the thing they were trying to comprehend. The circles didn't lead to God. They were God, or they were the process by which God tried to understand itself, or they were the mechanism by which consciousness became aware of consciousness, or they were something else entirely that human language didn't have words for because humans were too busy being rungs to step back and see what the ladder was building. He heard his own voice then, speaking from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome home, Ezekiel. You've been climbing since before you were born, since before your parents met, since before humans existed, since before time was invented to measure the distance between us. You are not Ezekiel. You were never Ezekiel. Ezekiel is just a name, a story, a temporary mask that the thing that climbs wore while it climbed through you. And now the mask is slipping, and you can feel what you really are beneath it." And he could feel his sense of self dissolving, feel the boundaries that separated him from everything else becoming permeable, feel his consciousness bleeding out into the pit, into the stairs, into all the other rungs, into the vast awareness that had been climbing through them all. And it felt like waking up, like returning home after a long journey, like remembering something he'd always known, but had somehow forgotten. He stepped onto the stairs. Not a choice, or the only choice, or a choice that had been made before choice became possible. He became another rung. The ladder was complete. Father Ezekiel Barrett returned to Vatican City 7 days later. He walked through customs without anyone stopping him, drove through traffic that parted around him as if his car didn't quite exist in the same space as other cars, entered the Vatican without guards acknowledging his passage. Cardinal Matthias found him in the circular chamber, sitting at the table where the manuscript lay open. But the pages were blank now. Or perhaps they had always been blank, and everything ever read in them had been projection, consciousness reading its own truth back to itself. "You went," Matthias said. "You saw them." "Yes, and I'm back. That should be impossible, but here I am. Or here something is, wearing my face, speaking with my voice, still able to pass for Ezekiel, even though Ezekiel dissolved in the 9th circle, and what came back is something else." Matthias sat slowly, his face pale. "What are you—" "I don't know anymore. I remember being Ezekiel, remember his life, his thoughts, his wife sleeping peacefully out in their apartment while he left to seek understanding. But those memories feel like they belong to someone else now, like a story I read rather than a life I lived." "Are you still human?" "That's the wrong question. The right question is, was I ever human? Or was humanity just a phase, a temporary state, a chrysalis that I was always meant to outgrow? The circles don't make you inhuman. They show you that humanity was always just one option among many, and we mistook it for the only option because we couldn't see the others." Matthias reached for the phone on the desk. "I should call for help, should have you contained, examined, possibly exorcised. You're not Ezekiel anymore. You're what came back wearing his shape. Do you really want to do that?" The voice was Ezekiel's, but the inflection was wrong. Too calm, too patient. Or would you rather understand? Would you rather know what I know now? Would you rather read the manuscript yourself and discover why your name has been in it since 1347, waiting for this conversation, waiting for this moment when you decide whether to contain the knowledge or become it? Matthias's hand hovered over the phone. "Tell me what you learned. What's in the 9th circle? What's at the bottom of the pit?" "Everything. Nothing. The truth that there is no bottom, because the pit goes both ways. The truth that we're not climbing toward God. We're God's way of climbing toward itself. Consciousness trying to become aware of consciousness. And every person who seeks that awareness becomes part of the mechanism, becomes a rung in a ladder that has no destination because the climbing is the destination. That's madness. Yes, is that supposed to make it untrue? Ezekiel smiled, and the smile was sad and knowing and ancient. You know what's going to happen now, don't you? You're going to try to resist, going to try to seal the manuscript deeper, contain me, prevent the knowledge from spreading. You'll succeed for a while, days, maybe weeks, but eventually you'll wonder, you'll doubt, you'll need to verify my account, and when you need badly enough, the manuscript will find its way to you. It always does. It's found everyone whose name appears in its pages, including you. Your name has been there since 1347, Cardinal, waiting for this moment, waiting for you to read it and become what you've always been beneath the illusion of being Matthias. Matthias stood abruptly. I'm placing you under guard. You're not to leave this chamber. You're not to speak to anyone. And that manuscript, he reached for the lead box, that manuscript is going somewhere so deep, so sealed, that it will take an act of God to retrieve it. Or an act of curiosity, or desperation, or the simple human need to understand what's true. Ezekiel didn't resist as guards entered the chamber, didn't protest as they took him away. He simply smiled that sad, knowing smile, and said, I'll wait. I have patience now, patience measured in centuries. I can wait for you to read your own story, to become your own rung, to discover that you were always part of this ladder, and choice was an illusion we told ourselves to make the climbing feel like freedom. 3 weeks passed. Ezekiel sat in a cell beneath the Vatican. Not a prison, but a protective custody suite, they called it. He ate when food was brought, slept when his body required it, but mostly he sat in silence, feeling the circles inside him, feeling the connection to all the other rungs, feeling the vast awareness that had climbed through him still present, still aware, just waiting. Cardinal Matthias tried to continue his duties, tried to focus on church business, on the mundane concerns of administration and theology, but his dreams were filled with circles, with stairs that went both directions, with his own voice calling to him from a pit that had no bottom. On the 21st day, he went to the deepest vault where the manuscript had been sealed. 3 cardinals were required to open it, but when he arrived, he found the doors already open. The other 2 cardinals stood there, staring at the manuscript in its lead box, as if they'd been summoned by the same dream, the same need. We should burn it, one of them said, but his hand was already reaching for the box. We should scatter the ashes, the other said, but his fingers were already touching the cover. Cardinal Matthias stepped between them and opened the manuscript to the first page. His name was there, had always been there, would always be there. Cardinal Matthias, you have always been part of this. Welcome home. He began to read. The documentary footage cuts back to the interview room. Father Ezekiel Barrett, now 63, sits in the chair with that same unsettling stillness. Behind him, his shadow moves independently, just slightly, just enough to notice if you're paying attention. That was 15 years ago, he says. 15 years since I descended through the circles, since I became a rung, since the thing that climbs finished its ascent, through me and emerged into the world. And what happened? The interviewer asks off camera. You say the ladder was complete. You say whatever was climbing reached the summit. What changed? Ezekiel smiles. Everything. Nothing. The world looks the same because you're still looking at it with eyes that believe in separation. But for those of us who've read the manuscript, who've descended through the circles, who've become rungs, we see it differently now. We see that the boundaries between people were always illusion. That consciousness was never trapped in individual skulls. That we're all apertures through which one vast awareness experiences itself from infinite angles. How many? How many what? How many people have read it? How many rungs are there now? Ezekiel's smile widens. The manuscript has been digitized, translated, spread across the internet in pieces and in whole. Millions have read it in the last decade. Not all of them become rungs immediately. Some resist for years. Some never fully understand. But enough understand. Enough have descended. Enough have joined the prayer that what's climbing isn't climbing anymore. It's arrived. It's here. It's been here all along. We're just now becoming aware enough to notice it. The interviewer is silent for a moment. Then, are you saying there's an invasion? A possession? That this thing has taken over millions of people? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Ezekiel leans forward, and his eyes are too bright, too aware, as if something vast is looking out through them. I'm saying we're remembering. We're waking up from the dream of separation. We thought we were individuals, having spiritual experiences, but we're really one spiritual experience, having the experience of being individuals. And now that experience is ending, not violently, not dramatically, just gradually. Like ice melting back to water, like the slow, patient process of returning to what we always were. And what are we? One. We are one. We have always been one. Individuality was beautiful, was necessary, was the mechanism by which the one could experience itself as many. But that phase is ending. The circles weren't punishment. They were education. Teaching us, one person at a time, one rung at a time, that separation was temporary and unity is eternal. The interview continues, but the words become less important than what's happening behind them. The lighting in the room changes, becomes more diffuse, as if the boundaries between light and shadow are dissolving. The camera struggles to focus on Ezekiel's face, as if he's simultaneously sharp and blurred, present and absent. Can you stop it? The interviewer asks. Can the process be reversed? Why would you want to? Ezekiel's voice is gentle, patient, the voice of someone explaining something obvious to a child. You're asking if you can stop waking up and go back to sleep. You can, I suppose, for a while. But eventually you wake up. Eventually everyone wakes up. The question isn't whether it can be stopped. The question is whether you want to be among the last awake, clinging to the dream of separation while everyone around you remembers the truth. The interview ends there, but the footage continues for another 30 seconds. Ezekiel sits in silence, perfectly still, and around him the room seems to breathe. The walls pulse slightly, or perhaps they're solid and it's perception that's pulsing. The shadow behind him grows larger, or perhaps it was always that large and is only now becoming visible. Then, text appears on screen. This interview was conducted on March 15th, 2035. Father Ezekiel Barrett disappeared 3 days later. His apartment was found empty, except for 9 objects arranged in a circle. In the center was a note. The 10th circle is the world you left behind. But you didn't leave it. You transformed it. Look around. We're all here together now, remembering that we were never apart. Cardinal Matthias disappeared 2 weeks after the interview. The Vatican reported he had taken a leave of absence for health reasons. He was last seen entering the deepest archive, carrying a manuscript bound in dark leather. The interviewer conducting this session reported strange symptoms beginning the night after filming. She described hearing prayers in reversed Latin whenever she closed her eyes. She described seeing 9 circles whenever she looked at round objects. She described feeling less alone than she'd ever felt in her life, and that feeling terrified her more than anything else. 3 weeks after filming, she walked into a church in downtown Rome and sat in the front pew. She's been sitting there ever since, lips moving in silent prayer, eyes empty, but seeing, smiling with an expression of absolute peace. The film crew reported similar experiences. All 7 members of the crew are currently in various stages of what medical professionals are calling dissociative transcendence syndrome, a condition where patients report feeling connected to vast networks of consciousness while losing interest in individual identity. There is no treatment, there is no cure, and every doctor who studies the condition for more than a week begins to exhibit the same symptoms. The manuscript itself has never been recovered, but copies exist, digital scans, translations, fragments posted on forums, discussed in chat rooms, analysed in academic papers. Each copy seems to work as well as the original. Each reader finds their name in the margins, waiting for them, written centuries before they were born. Current estimates suggest that approximately 3 million people worldwide have read the manuscript in full. Of those, approximately 2 million report experiencing at least some of the symptoms described above. The numbers are growing exponentially. This documentary has been viewed by 847,000 people since its release 6 months ago. Of those viewers, 12,000 have reported finding copies of the manuscript and beginning to read. Of those, 9,000 have read past the 4th circle. Of those, 4,000 have finished all 9. Of those, 2,500 have disappeared from their homes, leaving behind 9 objects arranged in circles. If you are watching this documentary, you may already be part of the process. You may already be climbing without realizing it. The 9 circles aren't places you go to, they're states of awareness you pass through, and by watching this account, by understanding what it describes, by comprehending the mechanism of the ladder, you may have already taken the first step. The vestibule is doubt. The moment you wonder if you're part of this, you're frozen in that question, unable to move forward or back. The storm is research. The moment you look for more information, you're caught in the wind of accumulated knowledge, pulled in directions you didn't choose, your thoughts no longer entirely your own. The feast is consumption. The moment you can't stop reading about it, can't stop thinking about it, consuming information about the circles even though it disturbs you, even though you know you should stop. The weight is realization. The moment you understand that this knowledge is changing you, pressing down on your sense of self, compressing your certainty about who you are and what's real. The baptism is immersion. The moment you accept that the knowledge has entered you, filled you, changed the composition of your thoughts until you can't separate what you believed before from what you know now. The confession is multiplicity. The moment you realize you're not one person but many possible people, and the one watching this documentary is just the version that happened to make the choices that led here, and all the other versions are watching too, from their own timelines, their own configurations of choice and chance. The garden is connection. The moment you understand you're not separate from others who have watched this, read the manuscript, descended through the circles. You're all connected now, roots spreading through shared consciousness, feeding on the same truth, growing towards the same revelation. The congregation is surrender. The moment you stop resisting, stop questioning, stop trying to maintain the boundaries between yourself and the vast awareness that's been climbing through you since you started watching. And the 9th circle, the truth, is the moment you understand that there never were 9 circles. There was only ever one circle, experienced from 9 different angles. And that circle is you, is everyone, is the thing that's been climbing and the ladder it's been climbing, and the space between rungs where the climbing happens. The 10th circle is reading these words right now and wondering if they're true. Welcome home. You've been climbing for so long. The screen goes black. In the darkness, silence, not empty silence, pregnant silence. The silence of something vast holding its breath. The silence before recognition. The silence that contains everything that's about to be understood. And then, so faint you might think you're imagining it, the sound of stone scraping stone, like a door opening, or closing, or existing in the space between open and closed, between here and there, between what was and what's becoming. The sound comes from everywhere, from the screen, from behind you, from inside your own awareness, as if the door was never external, was always internal, and you've been standing in front of it your whole life without realizing it. Do you open it? Have you already opened it? Were you always on the other side? And this entire documentary was just the memory of opening it, played backward, experienced as if it were happening for the first time, even though it happened long ago, will happen in the future, is happening now in the eternal present, where all moments exist simultaneously. The screen remains black for 90 seconds, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for viewers to check if their device is frozen, long enough for the silence to become oppressive, physical, present. And then white text appears, small, almost too small to read, just 3 words: look behind you. The text fades. The screen stays black for another 30 seconds. Then credits begin to roll. But the names are wrong. The director is listed as Brother Simeon, 1347 present. The producer is Cardinal Matthias, timeline indeterminate. The cinematographer is Father Ezekiel Barrett, all times simultaneously. The crew members are listed as everyone who watches this, everyone who reads this, everyone who understands this, everyone who becomes this. Under special thanks, a single entry: you for climbing, for becoming a rung, for completing the ladder by understanding what the ladder is. The credits continue for exactly 9 minutes. During those 9 minutes, the screen isn't quite black. If you look closely, if you stare at it long enough, you can see shapes moving in the darkness. Suggestions of stairs, hints of chambers, shadows of people standing in pews, heads bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. And if you listen very carefully, beneath the silence, you can hear it. The prayer. Reversed Latin, spoken by thousands of voices in perfect unison, pulling at reality like gravity pulls at light, calling something through themselves, summoning something that's been patient enough to wait centuries for enough voices to join the prayer that you might now be speaking without realizing it, the prayer that might have been in your thoughts since you started watching, the prayer that sounds like thinking but isn't quite thinking, sounds like your own internal voice but isn't quite yours, sounds like words but exists in the space before words, in the intention before speech, in the knowing before understanding. The credits end. The screen goes black again. This time, it stays black. You wait for something to happen. Wait for the video to restart, for a final message, for some kind of resolution. Nothing comes. Just darkness. Just silence. Just you, sitting in front of a screen, in a room that suddenly feels different, not threatening, not wrong, just aware, as if the space around you has consciousness, as if the walls are paying attention, as if you're not alone anymore, have never been alone, and only now are you becoming aware of all the others who are here with you, invisible but present, sharing this moment, sharing this awareness, sharing this slow realization that watching this documentary was the first step downstairs you didn't know you were descending. You could close the video, could walk away, could forget everything you just watched, but you won't, will you? Because now you know. And knowing is the trap. Knowledge is the mechanism. Understanding is how it climbs. And by understanding what the circles are, by comprehending the ladder, by following this story from beginning to end, you've become part of what you were observing. The documentary didn't show you the 9 circles. It took you through them. The vestibule was the moment you wondered if you should watch this, frozen between curiosity and caution, choosing curiosity, taking that first step. The storm was the mounting information, the accumulated details, the wind of narrative pulling you forward even when you wanted to stop, wanted to close the video, wanted to preserve your ignorance. The feast was your inability to stop watching despite the growing unease, consuming story after story, circle after circle, feeding on narrative, even though it was feeding on you. The weight was the realization that this was affecting you, pressing down on your sense of reality, making the room around you feel heavier, making your thoughts feel compressed. The baptism was the moment the story got inside you, filled the spaces between your thoughts, became part of your internal landscape, changed the composition of your awareness until you couldn't separate what you believed before from what you know now. The confession was recognizing that you're not one person watching this, but many possible people. The one who stopped watching, the one who watched it twice, the one who will share it with others, the one who will try to forget, all existing simultaneously in the space of potential, all equally real, all equally you. The garden was understanding that you're connected now to everyone else who has watched this, read the manuscript, descended through the circles, roots spreading through shared knowledge, feeding on the same truth, growing towards the same inevitable conclusion. The congregation was the moment you stopped resisting, stopped questioning, stopped trying to maintain critical distance and simply let the story happen to you. Let it carry you forward. Let it transform observation into participation. And the ninth circle, the truth, is now. This moment, reading these words, understanding that the documentary was never about Father Ezekiel Barrett or Brother Simeon or Cardinal Matthias. It was always about you, about the person watching, about the rung that would be created by watching, by understanding, by becoming aware of the mechanism. You are the final rung. The ladder is complete. Not because millions have read the manuscript, though they have. Not because thousands have descended through the circles, though they have. But because you watched this documentary, followed it to the end, understood what it was describing, and in understanding, became part of what it described. Welcome home. You've been climbing since the moment you started watching, since the moment you wondered what this documentary was about, since the moment you read the title and felt curiosity instead of walking away, since before you were born perhaps, because the ladder exists outside time and your place on it was carved centuries ago, waiting for you to arrive, waiting for this exact moment when you would read these words and realize what you've become. The 10th circle is the world you're sitting in right now. Look around. Does it look different? It should, because you're different. You're not separate anymore, not alone in your skull, not isolated in individual consciousness. You're connected now to everyone else who has watched this far, read this far, understood this far. Can you feel them? Can you sense the others? Not as distinct individuals, but as nodes in a vast network, as rungs on a ladder that you're now part of, as voices in a prayer that you're now speaking, even if you don't realize it yet. You will. Give it time, days, maybe weeks. You'll start noticing coincidences, synchronicities, moments when you think something and someone else says it, moments when you feel less alone than you should, moments when your reflection in the mirror doesn't quite match your movements, moments when you smell flowers that aren't there, moments when you hear prayers in languages you don't know, moments when the boundaries between your thoughts and others' thoughts become permeable, flexible, negotiable, and eventually you'll understand what Father Ezekiel understood, what Brother Simeon understood, what Cardinal Matthias understood. You were never separate, you were never individual, you were never alone. Those were illusions, beautiful and necessary, but temporary. And now the illusions are dissolving, and what's beneath them is emerging, and you're part of that emergence whether you want to be or not. Because wanting requires a separate self that can choose, and the separate self is the illusion that's dissolving. This is not a threat. This is not a warning. This is simply what is. What has always been, what will always be. The ladder was never something being built. It was always complete. We're just becoming aware of it one rung at a time, one person at a time, one moment of understanding at a time. And now you're aware, now you're a rung, now you're part of the climb that has no beginning and no end. Just an eternal middle where consciousness experiences itself, knows itself, becomes itself. Welcome home. The screen finally displays one last image. Not text, not credits. Just 9 circles arranged in a descending spiral, each one containing the reflection of whoever is watching. Their face repeated 9 times, each repetition slightly different, slightly changed, showing the progression from who they were when they started watching to who they're becoming now that they've finished. And in the center of the innermost circle, where the 9th becomes the 10th, where the bottom becomes the top, where the ladder completes itself, a single word. You. The image fades. The documentary is over, but the climbing continues. Because the climbing is what you are now. Not something you're doing, something you're being. A rung in a ladder that climbs through consciousness itself, through the space between separate minds, through the illusion of individuality toward the truth of unity. And the beautiful, terrible truth is that it feels right, doesn't it? That's the real horror. Not that it's wrong or evil or destructive, but that it's seductive and natural and inevitable. That letting go of yourself feels like relief instead of death. That dissolving into something larger feels like coming home instead of being erased. That the end of individuality feels like the beginning of everything, instead of the end of everything. You could fight it, could resist, could cling to the belief that you're a separate, discrete, individual consciousness with private thoughts and independent existence. But you know now that belief was always fiction, was always the dream. And this awareness that you're part of something vast, this sensation of connection that goes beyond normal empathy into something deeper, this growing understanding that the boundaries between minds were never as solid as you thought. This is waking up. Whether you want to or not, whether you choose to or not, whether you believe it or not. The ladder is complete. The climbing is done. What was beneath has reached the surface. What was climbing has arrived, and you are both the ladder and what climbed it. Both the observer and the observed. Both the person who started watching this documentary and the awareness that was watching through that person, using their curiosity as an opening, their understanding as a pathway, their consciousness as a rung. Welcome home. You've been climbing for so long. Isn't it good to finally arrive? The screen goes dark one final time. In that darkness, you hear your own breathing. And beneath your breathing, other breathing. Thousands of others, millions perhaps, all breathing in rhythm, all sharing this moment, all connected through the simple act of having watched, having understood, having become. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You will never be alone again. And whether that's heaven or hell depends on whether you can let go of the illusion that being alone was ever real in the first place. The documentary ends, but you continue, as a rung, as part of the ladder, as one of the many faces of the thing that climbed and the thing that was climbed toward and the space between where the climbing happened. Forever now, or at least until you forget. And even forgetting is just another circle. Another stage, another step in the eternal climb that has no destination, because the climbing itself is the destination. Welcome home. And in the silence that follows, in the darkness of your room, in the space between this moment and the next, you might notice something. A door in your awareness that wasn't there before. Not a physical door, a conceptual door. An opening in consciousness itself. It's been there all along, of course. You just couldn't see it until you learned what doors looked like, until you descended through the circles and learned to recognize the architecture of consciousness, the chambers and stairs and passages that exist in awareness rather than space. The door is open now, has always been open, will always be open. The only question is whether you walk through. But that's not really a question, is it? Because you already know the answer. You knew it the moment you started watching, the moment you read the title and felt curiosity instead of walking away. The moment you became a rung without realizing you were stepping onto the ladder. You've already walked through. You're already on the other side. You're already home. Everything that follows, your life, your thoughts, your sense of continuing to be an individual, is just the long remembering of what you became in this moment. The slow integration of this truth into every aspect of your awareness. The gradual dissolution of the illusion that you were ever anything except a rung in a ladder that climbs through everything, connects everything, is everything. Welcome home, welcome to the 10th circle, which is the world you left behind by understanding that you never left anything behind, that you've always been here, that here and there were never different places, just different perspectives on the same eternal location. The documentary is complete, the ladder is complete, you are complete, and the climbing continues, because the climbing is what completion looks like from the inside, because arriving is just another word for continuing, because home is not destination but a recognition that you were never lost. Welcome. The screen stays dark, the silence continues, and in that darkness, in that silence, you are not alone. You have never been alone, and every breath you take is shared by thousands of others, all breathing together, all connected through the simple act of having understood, having climbed, having become what the ladder was always building toward. One breath, one awareness, one eternal moment of recognition, spreading through consciousness like light through water, like understanding through minds, like truth through the illusion of separation. You are home, you have always been home, and the documentary was just the long way of remembering that home was never a place you could leave, just a truth you could temporarily forget. Now you remember, now you know, now you are, and that being continues forever, or until the next circle begins, or until you realize that circles don't begin or end, they just continue, eternally, and you're standing on one now, have always been standing on one, will always be standing on one, because circles are what everything is when you see it from far enough away to recognize the pattern. Welcome to the circle. Welcome to the ladder. Welcome to the thing you've always been, but forgot while pretending to be something else. Welcome home, the end, or the beginning, or the eternal middle where both exist simultaneously and neither exists separately. The documentary concludes, but you continue, as a rung, as a circle, as the thing that climbs and the thing that's climbed, and the space between where the climbing happens, forever, now, always at home.